The child is born in the first year of Robert's reign, squalling and red-faced, with a thatch of black hair and a grip that closes around the maester's finger with the blind, furious strength of a Baratheon. Cersei Lannister holds her firstborn and feels two things at once: the animal rush of motherhood and the cold recognition that this child, this black-haired, blue-eyed, unmistakably Robert's son, has just sealed her inside a cage she will spend the rest of her life trying to escape. This is the story of the son who should not have been, and the kingdom he inherits, and the price that every person who touches that kingdom pays for it. The black-haired boy, they named him Stefan, after Robert's father. The naming was Robert's idea, one of his few ideas in those early days that Cersei did not fight because the name served her purposes as well as his. Stefan Baratheon, a name that anchored the boy to his father's line, that reminded the realm whose blood ran in the prince's veins. That was, in its own way, a declaration. This is not a Lannister child. This is a Baratheon. The child had his father's colouring, black hair, blue eyes, the broad build that would become Baratheon heft as he grew. Grand Maester Pycelle examined the boy on the first day and pronounced him healthy, strong, and unmistakably the king's own. The pronouncement was unnecessary, the colouring alone was proof. But Pycelle delivered it with the ceremonial gravity that maesters brought to announcements that confirmed what everyone already knew. Robert held his son on the second day. The king was drunk, which was not unusual, but the drunkenness had a quality that Cersei had not seen before. A softening, a gentleness, the temporary dissolution of the bravado that Robert wore like armor. He held the infant against his chest and looked at the small face with an expression that was not the king's expression, but a younger man's. A man who had lost his parents at sea and who was seeing, in the infant's features, the father he had lost. "Stefan," Robert said. "My boy. My heir." Cersei watched from the bed. The watching was assessment, the habitual evaluation that Cersei performed on every interaction, measuring leverage, calculating angles, determining how each moment could be turned to advantage. The child was Robert's. The child was hers. The child was also a problem, because the child was proof that Robert's seed was strong, that the Baratheon blood bred true, and that any subsequent children who did not carry the Baratheon features would be questioned. Which meant that the arrangement Cersei had been maintaining with Jaime, the twin brother, the lover, the Kingsguard knight, whose presence in the Red Keep was simultaneously a source of pleasure and a source of danger, had become exponentially more perilous. She told Jaime that night. He came to her chambers as he always did, through the passages, in the dark, with a silence that a knight of the Kingsguard could maintain when the knight's life depended on it. He stood by the window and looked at the cradle where Stefan slept, and said nothing for a time that communicated everything. "So," Jaime said, "Robert finally managed it. He's drunk less since I've been pregnant, or drunk differently. I don't know." Cersei's voice was flat, the voice she used when discussing things that disgusted her. The point is that the child is his. Obviously his, and any child that is not obviously his will be noticed. Then, we stop. We don't stop. We're more careful. We've been careful. We've been careful for 3 years, and now there's a black-haired boy in a cradle who proves that careful is not a permanent solution. Jaime, you've given him an heir, a healthy, black-haired, blue-eyed heir. Robert has what he wanted. The realm has what it needs. And he stopped. The stopping was not hesitation. It was the recognition that the sentence he was about to complete would commit him to a conclusion that neither of them wanted to hear. "We continue," Cersei said. "But differently. No more children. Not Robert's and not yours. Moon tea. Tansy. Whatever Pycelle or the Woods Witch can provide. One son is enough for Robert. One heir is enough for the realm. And no accidents." Jaime looked at her. His sister. His lover. The woman whose ambition operated like a blade, precise, relentless, indifferent to the tissue it severed. He loved her. He hated the parts of her that he loved. He loved the parts of her that he hated. The circularity was the architecture of his life, and the architecture was not something he could dismantle without demolishing himself. One son, he said, and no accidents. No accidents. The accident came 3 years later. Cersei conceived again. Roberts, undeniably the product of a night when the king's enthusiasm exceeded Cersei's precautions and the moon tea arrived too late. The child was Joffrey, golden-haired. Cersei's blood froze when the maester placed the infant in her arms. Golden hair, green eyes, the Lannister coloring, pure and unmistakable, on a child who was supposed to be Robert's, and who looked nothing like Robert and everything like Jaime. The panic was immediate and existential. Steffon was 3, black-haired, Baratheon to his bones. Joffrey was minutes old, golden-haired, Lannister to his marrow. The contrast would be visible to anyone who looked, and everyone in the 7 kingdoms would look. Because the birth of a second prince was an event that drew attention the way blood drew sharks. But the panic was premature. Grand Maester Pycelle examined the infant and declared him healthy, and when the golden hair was noted by the serving women, by the court, by Robert himself, Pycelle produced the observation that saved Cersei's secret. The Queen's Lannister blood is strong. Prince Steffon favors his father. Prince Joffrey favors his mother. It is common in families of strong lineage for children to alternate between the parents' coloring. Robert accepted this. Robert accepted most things that did not require sustained attention, and the coloring of his second son was, to Robert, a matter of curiosity rather than concern. The boy was his queen's. The boy was his. The maester said so. The coloring was explained. Robert returned to his hunting and his drinking and his whoring, and the golden-haired prince slept in his golden cradle, and the black-haired prince played in the yard, and the lie sat between them like a foundation crack that no one noticed, because the building above it was still standing. 2 more children followed. Myrcella, golden-haired and green-eyed. Tommen, golden-haired and green-eyed. Each birth tightened the knot in Cersei's chest. Each golden-haired child was a piece of evidence that accumulated alongside the black-haired firstborn, the contrast sharpening with every year that passed. But the evidence did not accumulate into a case. No one looked. No one questioned. The realm had an heir, Prince Steffon, black-haired, blue-eyed, the image of his father, and the heir's existence provided a canopy of legitimacy that sheltered the golden children beneath it. Steffon was proof that Robert's seed was strong. Steffon's existence made the golden children's coloring a curiosity rather than a crisis. The crack in the foundation was real, but the building stood because the first stone, the black-haired boy, was solid. Steffon grew. He was not Robert, not the brawling, booming, larger-than-life force that Robert had been at the same age. But he was Robert's son in the ways that heredity permitted, tall, strong, black-haired, with an athleticism that expressed itself in sword work and riding, rather than in the raw physical dominance that had made Robert the warrior who killed Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident. Where Robert had been a storm, Steffon was weather, capable of intensity but also of calm. The modulated temperament of a boy who had inherited his father's blood and his mother's intelligence, and who was learning to use both. He was also his mother's son. Cersei, who had poured her ambitions into the golden children, Joffrey especially, the boy who looked like Jaime. The boy who was the physical manifestation of her forbidden love, found herself unable to feel the same intensity for the black-haired prince who represented her cage rather than her desire. She did not hate Steffon. She could not hate her own child. But she loved him differently, the dutiful love of a mother performing motherhood rather than the fierce, possessive love that she lavished on the Golden Three. Steffon noticed. Children noticed everything that adults assumed they concealed, and the difference in his mother's treatment of him versus her treatment of Joffrey was visible in 1,000 small choices. Which child she reached for first? Which child she defended most vigorously? Which child's transgressions she forgave, and which child she punished? Steffon was 7 when he asked the question that children of cold mothers always ask. Mother, do you love Joffrey more than me? Don't be foolish. I love all my children. But you love him differently. You are the heir to the Iron Throne. You will be king. Joffrey will be your brother and your subject. The difference you feel is the difference between a crown and a castle. Both are valuable. One is heavier. The answer was Cersei at her most articulate, true enough to satisfy, false enough to conceal, precise enough to redirect. Stefan accepted it because 7-year-olds accepted their mother's explanations, and because the explanation, while inadequate, was not wrong. He was the heir, and the weight of that inheritance was already pressing on him in ways that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen did not experience. Robert, by contrast, loved Stefan with the uncomplicated pride that fathers felt for sons who resembled them. He took the boy hunting at 8, too young. Cersei protested, overruled, and the boy rode well and drew the bow with the strength that Robert's genes had guaranteed. Robert told the story at every feast afterward. My boy drew on a boar at 50 yards. 8 years old. 50 yards. Hit the beast in the shoulder. Didn't kill it, but by the gods, the boy can shoot. The pride was genuine, and it was nourishing, and Stefan absorbed it the way a plant absorbs sunlight, growing toward the source, bending in the direction of the warmth, becoming, year by year, the boy that Robert's approval shaped, physical, confident, willing to try, unafraid of failure. The shaping was Robert's gift, and the gift was imperfect. Robert's idea of fatherhood was irregular, punctuated by long absences and sudden enthusiasms, the attention of a man who loved his son, but who also loved wine and hunting, and the memory of wars he would never fight again. But the imperfection was, in its way, healthier than the perfection that Cersei's focused attention would have provided, because Robert's inconsistency taught Stefan self-reliance, while Cersei's focus would have taught dependence. Jon Arryn watched the prince grow, the hand of the king, the old lord, the foster father who had raised Robert and Ned Stark, the man who held the realm together through the application of patience and competence, while the king drank and the queen schemed, observed Stefan with the satisfaction of a man whose investment was producing returns. A legitimate heir, a capable boy, a prince who looked like a king, and who might, with guidance, govern like one. Arryn also watched the other children, the golden children, and Arryn, unlike Robert, was a man who paid sustained attention, and the attention produced questions, and the questions produced an investigation that would in time become the most dangerous investigation in the Seven Kingdoms. You. The hand's suspicion. You. Jon Arryn began asking questions in the 12th year of Robert's reign. The questions were not random. They were the systematic inquiries of a man who had noticed an anomaly and who was pursuing the anomaly through the methodical accumulation of evidence. The approach of a man trained in law and governance. A man who understood that accusations against a queen required proof that was overwhelming rather than suggestive. The anomaly was the golden children. Stefan was black-haired. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were golden-haired. The contrast was visible but had been explained. Lannister blood, maternal inheritance, the natural variation that occurred in families of mixed heritage. The explanation was plausible. Jon Arryn was a man who tested plausible explanations. He visited the armorers. He found Robert's bastards, the black-haired bastards, every one of them, scattered across King's Landing like evidence that the city's geography had organized for his convenience. Gendry at Tobho Mott's forge. Barra in her mother's arms in a house on the Street of Silk. Maya Stone in the Eyrie, reported by his own household. Every bastard Robert had fathered, and there were many, had black hair. The Baratheon colouring bred true. It bred true in every child except the 3 golden ones who slept in the Red Keep. He read the lineages and histories of the great houses of the 7 kingdoms. The book was a catalogue of marriages and offspring stretching back centuries. And the catalogue contained a pattern that Arryn was looking for, and that the pattern confirmed. Every Baratheon Lannister union in history had produced black-haired children. Not most. All. The Baratheon seed was dominant. The golden colouring did not appear in any child who had a Baratheon father. Aron shared his findings with Stannis Baratheon. The Lord of Dragonstone received the information with the grim satisfaction of a man whose suspicions were being confirmed, and whose satisfaction was poisoned by the personal implications. If the Golden Children were not Robert's, then the succession ran through Steffon to Stannis, and if Steffon died or was removed, Stannis was the heir. The calculation was cold. The calculation was Stannis. "We must tell Robert," Stannis said. "Not yet. The evidence is strong but circumstantial. Robert loves his children, all of them. He will not believe an accusation against his queen without proof that cannot be denied. What proof do you require? Every bastard is black-haired. Every historical precedent confirms it. The Golden Children are not Baratheons. They are Lannisters. And if they are Lannisters, then they are the product of. I know what they are the product of. And you know. And if we present this to Robert without adequate preparation, the result will be chaos. Robert's temper is a weapon. Sometimes it strikes the enemy, and sometimes it strikes the hand that wields it. We must approach this with care." The care was insufficient. Jon Arryn died 3 weeks later. The death was attributed to a sudden illness, a fever that came on rapidly, a deterioration that the maesters could not arrest, a death that was, in the assessment of Grand Maester Pycelle, the natural consequence of age and the accumulated stress of governance. The assessment was a lie. The death was poison, the tears of lice, administered by Arryn's own wife, Lysa, at the instruction of Petyr Baelish, who had his own designs on the realm and who recognized that Jon Arryn's investigation threatened not only the Queen, but the chaos that Baelish needed to advance. But the investigation did not die with Arryn. The investigation survived in 2 forms: in Stannis Baratheon's memory, and in a letter that Jon Arryn had written to Eddard Stark a week before his death, a letter that arrived at Winterfell 2 weeks after Arryn's funeral, and that said, in the formal language that Arryn used for matters of state, "I have discovered a truth about the royal children that you must hear in person. Come to King's Landing. The realm depends on it." Ned Stark read the letter and felt the obligation settle on him like a yoke. Jon Arryn, the man who had fostered him, raised him, taught him what honor meant, was dead, and the dead man's last request was that Ned come south. The timing was not coincidental. Robert was already planning to visit Winterfell, to offer Ned the position of Hand of the King, to replace the man who had died, to bring his oldest friend south to help him govern a realm that Robert had never wanted, and that was, in Robert's assessment, becoming ungovernable. The king's visit and the dead man's letter converged on Winterfell with the symmetry of a trap that no one had designed, but that everyone was walking into. Robert Baratheon arrived at Winterfell with his household, his court, and his eldest son. Prince Steffon was 14, tall for his age, broad-shouldered, black-haired, riding a destrier that was too large for him and managing it well. The prince entered Winterfell beside his father, and the sight of them together, the king and the heir, the same coloring, the same build, the physical continuity of a dynasty, produced in the Northern Lords the satisfaction that stable succession always produced. The realm had a future, and the future looked like the present. Ned Stark knelt in the courtyard. Robert embraced him with the bear hug that was Robert's default greeting for men he loved, and the embrace was genuine, and the emotion behind it was the emotion of a man who was drowning in governance and who believed that his oldest friend could save him. "You got fat," Robert said. "Your grace is not exactly lean." The exchange was ritual, the same words they had traded at the Trident 15 years ago. The shared language of men who had been young together and who used humor to acknowledge the distance between who they had been and who they had become. The feast that followed was lavish by northern standards and austere by southern ones. Roasted meats, dark beer, bread. The solid fare that the north produced and that Robert consumed with the enthusiasm of a man whose appetite for food was matched only by his appetite for everything else. The Queen sat beside Robert with the composed beauty that was Cersei's constant, golden-haired, green-eyed, regal in a way that suggested breeding rather than warmth. Joffrey sat beside her, a mirror of her features, golden and sharp and already at 11, developing the petulance that would harden into cruelty. Stefan sat between his parents. The prince was polite, trained in the courtesies that a prince required, capable of conversation, comfortable in the company of adults in a way that suggested either maturity or practice. He spoke to Ned about Winterfell's history, asked intelligent questions about the godswood, and demonstrated a knowledge of northern customs that was unusual for a southern prince. John Arryn taught me, Stefan said when Ned mentioned the boy's knowledge. He said a king should know every part of his kingdom, not just the parts that look like the Red Keep. The mention of Arryn's name struck Ned like an unexpected blow. The grief of the mentor's death reopened by the student's casual reference. John Arryn had raised Robert and Ned. John Arryn had apparently also been raising Stefan. The continuity was both comforting and alarming because it suggested that Arryn had been investing in the prince with the deliberate intention of shaping a ruler, and that the shaping had been interrupted by Arryn's death. He was a good man, Ned said. The best hand the realm has had. Father says so. Mother says otherwise, but Mother says otherwise about most things Father says. The observation was casual and devastating. The 11-word summary of a marriage that a 14-year-old boy had absorbed through years of proximity and that he delivered without malice, as fact rather than judgment. Robert offered Ned the hand position the following night, in the crypt, beside Lyanna's statue, with the wine on his breath and the grief in his eyes that Lyanna's memory always produced. I need you, Ned. The realm needs you. Arryn is dead and the small council is snakes, and I can't govern this thing alone. Come south. Be my hand. Help me. Robert, don't refuse me. Not this. I've lost John. I've lost. The gesture toward Lyanna's statue was small and broken. I've lost enough. Don't make me lose you too. Ned looked at his dead friend's face and saw the man behind the king. The man who drank too much and loved too hard and missed the war, because the war was the last time he had been the man he wanted to be. The obligation was not political, it was personal. And personal obligations, for Ned Stark, were the ones that could not be refused. I'll come south. Good, and Ned, bring your girls. Sansa and Arya. Stefan needs friends his own age, who aren't Lannisters, and I want our families joined. Sansa for Stefan, when they're old enough. My heir and your daughter. Our houses united. The betrothal proposal was Robert's second offer, and the one that Cersei, when she learned of it, would fight with every weapon available to her. Because Sansa Stark's marriage to Stefan would bind the heir to the north and reduce Cersei's influence over the succession. And because the reduction of influence was, for Cersei, indistinguishable from the reduction of life. But Cersei was not at the feast when Robert proposed the betrothal. Cersei was in her chambers, writing a letter to Jaime that would be destroyed before morning, and that said, Stark is coming south. He knows something. Arryn told him, watch him. The letter was the first move in a game that Cersei did not know she had already lost. Because the black-haired boy in the feast hall was the move she could not counter. The legitimate heir whose existence made her golden children's futures secure enough to be unthreatened, and precarious enough to be devastating if the truth emerged. Stefan existed. And as long as Stefan existed, the golden children were spare princes, valued, protected, but secondary. The succession ran through the black-haired boy, and the black-haired boy was Robert's, and Robert's boy was safe, and the safety was Cersei's prison. The hand in King's Landing. Ned arrived in King's Landing on a day when the heat pressed down on the city like a hand, the air thick with the smell of 500,000 people living on top of each other in a geography that God had designed for a fishing village and that Aegon the Conqueror had redesigned for a capital. The Red Keep rose above the city on Aegon's Hill, the fortress palace that had been the seat of Targaryen power for 3 centuries, and that was now under its Baratheon occupants, showing the signs of a household that was maintained by inertia rather than intention. Ned took up the hand's duties with the grim efficiency of a man performing an obligation he had not sought. The small council meetings were a lesson in the kind of governance that Ned despised, the backroom dealings, the whispered conspiracies. the casual corruption that men like Petyr Baelish and Varys practiced as naturally as breathing. Littlefinger managed the treasury with the cheerful dishonesty of a man who believed that money was a form of energy and that the kingdom's energy should flow through his hands. Varys managed the intelligence network with the eunuch's perpetual smile and the eunuch's perpetual usefulness, providing information that was accurate and loyalty that was indeterminate. Grand Maester Pycelle managed the king's health with the competence of a maester and the agenda of a Lannister loyalist, dispensing medicines and advice with equal certainty and hiding, behind the veneer of doddering old age, a mind that was sharper than it appeared and loyalties that were older than his chain. Ned investigated Jon Arryn's death. The investigation was the obligation that Arryn's letter had imposed, and that Ned pursued with the methodical stubbornness that was his primary intellectual tool. He visited the armorers, as Arryn had. He found the bastards, as Arryn had. He read the book, the lineages and histories, and the pattern that Arryn had discovered revealed itself to Ned with the same clarity. Baratheon's seed was strong. The Golden Children were not Robert's. But Ned's investigation produced a conclusion that differed from the one Arryn had reached, because Ned's investigation included a variable that Arryn's had not: Steffon. The black-haired prince was proof that Robert's seed was strong, living, breathing, irrefutable proof, and the Golden Children's existence alongside Steffon was not merely an anomaly, but a contrast, a before and after that any observer with eyes could see. Ned went to Cersei. The meeting was in the Godswood, the small southern Godswood at the Red Keep, with its oak and elm instead of weirwoods, the god's space that was not Ned's god's space, but that served his purpose: privacy, solemnity, the weight of sacred ground. Cersei came in green silk with her guards at the garden's edge, and her composure intact, and the awareness, visible in the precision of her posture, that the conversation she was about to have was the conversation she had been dreading since the day Steffon was born. "Your children," Ned said. "Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen. They are not Roberts." Cersei's face did not change. The non-change was art, the controlled expression of a woman who had been preparing for this accusation for 14 years, and whose preparation was evident in the steadiness of her voice. "My children are mine, and they are the king's. They are yours and Jaime's. The coloring proves it. Every Baratheon bastard is black-haired. Every Baratheon child in the historical record is black-haired. Steffon is black-haired. The other three are golden. The blood tells the tale, and the tale is incest. Be careful, Lord Stark. Accusations against the Queen. I am not making an accusation. I am giving you a warning. Leave King's Landing. Take the Golden Children and go to Casterly Rock. Tell Robert whatever lie serves your purpose. Tell him you miss your father. Tell him the children need mountain air. Tell him anything. But go. Because when Robert learns the truth, and he will learn it, his anger will be terrible. And I cannot protect you from it. You would protect me? I would protect the children. They are innocent of their parents' crimes." Cersei studied Ned. The study was the evaluation of a woman assessing a man's character for weaknesses, and the evaluation's conclusion was visible in the faint shift of her expression. This man was honest. This man was warning her. This man's honor was both his weapon and his vulnerability, because a man who warned his enemies before striking them was a man who gave his enemies time to strike first. "You are a fool, Eddard Stark. An honorable, predictable, dangerous fool. You have given me a warning instead of going to Robert. You have given me time. And you will regret the gift." She left the Godswood. Ned stood among the southern trees and felt the foreboding that came from knowing he had done the right thing and suspecting that the right thing would produce the wrong result. The king's rage. Cersei did not flee. Cersei never fled. Flight was a concession that her pride could not produce. Instead, she went to Robert. The going to was preemptive. The decision of a woman who recognized that Ned Stark would tell Robert the truth and who calculated that the truth, delivered by her on her terms, was less dangerous than the truth delivered by Ned on his. But Cersei's version of the truth was not the truth. It was a construction, an elaborate, emotionally calibrated construction designed to redirect Robert's anger from the incest to the accuser. "Your hand has gone mad," Cersei told Robert. She found him in his chambers, drunk but not insensate, the hour between dinner and sleep when Robert's defenses were lowest and his emotions closest to the surface. "Stark is telling people that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are not your children, that they are Jaime's, that I have been lying to you for 14 years. Robert's face went through a transformation that Cersei had anticipated and counted on. Not the rage, which would come, but the disbelief. The disbelief was the stage she needed, because disbelief was the emotion that preceded evaluation, and the evaluation could be directed. Stark said what? He confronted me in the Godswood. He told me to leave King's Landing. He told me to take the children and go. He said you would be angry when you learned the truth. His truth. A truth that is a lie. Ned wouldn't. Ned is investigating Jon Arryn's death. He has been visiting armorers and whorehouses and reading old books, and he has constructed a theory that the Golden Children are bastards. The theory is based on hair color. Hair color, Robert. He is accusing your queen of incest because your younger children have my coloring instead of yours. Stefan is black-haired. Stefan takes after you. The others take after me. This is not unusual. My mother was golden-haired. My father was golden-haired. The Lannister coloring is strong, but Stark has convinced himself that any child who does not look like you must not be yours, and he is prepared to present this accusation to you as fact. Robert's face shifted. The disbelief was giving way to the anger that Cersei had anticipated, but the anger's direction was uncertain. It could point at Cersei. It could point at Ned. It could point at the world in general, which was Robert's default target when the anger was too large for a single object. "I'll talk to Ned. You'll talk to the man who is accusing me of fucking my own brother. You'll listen to him present evidence that consists of hair color and old books. And then you'll decide whether you believe the man you've known for 30 years or the wife you've shared a bed with for 15. The conversation was Cersei's masterpiece, the manipulation of a man she despised by a woman whose survival depended on his credulity. She had not denied the accusation. She had redirected it, converted it from a question about her fidelity into a question about Ned's judgment, transformed the evidence from damning to ridiculous by reducing it to hair color and old books. The redirection was brilliant, and it was insufficient, because Robert was not a fool. Robert was a man who did not want to think, which was different from a man who could not think. And the difference would matter. Ned came to Robert the next morning. He came with the book, with the records of the bastards, with the weight of evidence that Jon Arryn had assembled and that Ned had confirmed. "Robert, I have something to tell you about the Queen's children. Cersei told me what you'd say." The words stopped Ned cold. The stopping was visible, the physical arrest of a man who had planned a conversation and who was discovering that the conversation had been rerouted before it began. "She told you?" "She told me you'd accuse her. She told me you'd say the children aren't mine. She told me you'd present hair color as proof of incest." Robert's voice was controlled, the dangerous control of a man holding anger in check while he determined where to aim it. "Is she right?" "Robert, the evidence. Is she right? Did you accuse my wife of fucking her brother?" "I told Cersei what I found. I told her to leave King's Landing before I brought the evidence to you. I gave her a chance to go peacefully. You gave the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms a chance to flee without consulting me, without telling me first. You went to her before you came to me. I was trying to protect the children. The children. My children. You were trying to protect my children by telling their mother to run. The logic of Ned's position was sound. Go to Cersei first. Give her a chance to flee. Spare the children the violence of Robert's reaction. The execution was catastrophic. By going to Cersei before Robert, Ned had given her the initiative, and Cersei had used the initiative the way she used every advantage, ruthlessly. "Robert, listen to me. Every bastard you've fathered is black-haired. Stefan is black-haired. Every Baratheon in the historical record married to a Lannister produced black-haired children. The 3 golden children are anomalies that the precedent does not support. They're my wife's children. They have her colouring. Have you looked at Joffrey? Have you looked at him next to Jaime? The resemblance is enough. The roar was Robert, the full-throated bellow of a man whose patience had been exceeded and whose anger was now pointing in the direction that Cersei had intended. Not at Cersei. At Ned. At the friend who was telling him something he did not want to hear, who was presenting evidence for a conclusion that threatened to unravel the only part of Robert's life that he had not already ruined through neglect. You are my hand. You are my friend, and you are standing in my chambers, telling me that my wife is a whore, and my children are bastards, and my brother is the father of 3 of my 4 offspring. Do you understand what you're saying? I understand. Then prove it. Not with hair color, not with books. Prove it in a way that cannot be denied. Bring me evidence that a king can act on, not suspicion that a lord can gossip about. Because if you are wrong about this, Ned, I will send you home and find another hand, and our friendship will not survive the sending. The ultimatum was Robert's compromise, the middle ground between believing Ned and believing Cersei, the king's version of fairness. Prove it. Robert was not dismissing the accusation. He was demanding better evidence. And the demand was, in its way, the most dangerous thing Robert could have done, because the demand gave Cersei time, and time was the commodity that Cersei used more effectively than anyone in the 7 kingdoms. Steffan was 14, and he was not deaf. The prince heard the argument between his parents, not the words, which were muffled by stone walls and oak doors, but the volume and the duration and the raw timbre of his father's anger, which was different from the anger Robert displayed during council meetings or hunting complaints. This anger was personal. This anger had heat. He heard the servants' whispers. Servants whispered in the Red Keep the way water ran in the sewers, constantly, invisibly, carrying information from room to room and floor to floor, in a network that no master of whispers could match, because the network operated on proximity rather than loyalty. The whispers said that Lord Stark had accused the Queen. The whispers said that the accusation involved the princes and the princess. The whispers said words that Steffan heard and catalogued and refused to understand, because understanding them would require confronting possibilities that a 14-year-old's mind was not equipped to process. He went to Ned Stark. The hand of the king was in his solar, working at the desk that had been Jon Arryn's desk, reading documents that had been Jon Arryn's documents, performing the work that Jon Arryn's death had left unfinished. Ned looked up when Steffan entered, and the look carried the guilt that honest men felt when they were seen by the people their honesty was about to damage. Prince Steffan. Lord Stark. May I ask you a question? You may. My mother says you've accused her of something. My father is angry. The servants are frightened. Will you tell me what's happening? Ned looked at the boy, 14, black-haired, blue-eyed, bearing the face that proved the accusation and the bearing that suggested the boy could handle the answer. The question of whether to tell the truth to a 14-year-old prince whose world would be destroyed by the telling was the kind of question that Ned's honor could not answer. Because honor said always tell the truth, and compassion said not to this boy, not now. I am investigating the death of Jon Arryn. The investigation has led me to conclusions that your mother disputes. Your father has asked me to prove those conclusions. That is all I can tell you. You're lying. I'm withholding. Lord Stark, my tutor, taught me that the difference between lying and withholding is the difference between a locked door and a wall. Both keep you out. Only one pretends there's an entrance. Ned allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Arryn had taught this boy. The quality of the teaching was evident. When the matter is resolved, you will be told the full truth. I give you my word, and if the matter is not resolved in my favor, then you will need the truth more than anyone. Steffan left. He went to the practice yard, where the master-at-arms was drilling the squires, and he took a sword and hit the practice dummy until his arms ached and his hands bled through the gloves and the dummy's padding was hanging in strips. The violence was not therapeutic. It was the only language available to a boy who had too many questions and not enough adults willing to answer them. Joffrey found him in the yard afterward. Joffrey was 11, golden-haired, green-eyed, already developing the thin-lipped smirk that would become his signature expression. Joffrey was not a pleasant child. He was sharp in ways that were not intelligence but cruelty, the sharpness of a boy who had learned that his birth gave him power over others and who exercised the power for entertainment rather than purpose. Hitting things again? How very common. Go away, Joffrey. Mother told me Lord Stark is making trouble, told me he's been saying things about us, about me and Myrcella and Tommen. I don't know what he's saying. I do, Lancel told me. Lancel heard the servants. They say Stark is claiming we're bastards, that our father isn't our father. Stefan turned. The turn was slow. The deliberate rotation of an older brother facing a younger one with information that the older brother did not want to process, and that the younger brother was delivering with the casual venom that was Joffrey's preferred mode of interaction. Lancel is a gossip, and you should stop listening to gossips. Is it true? I don't know. You don't know if we're bastards. I don't know what Lord Stark has found. I don't know what Mother has done. I don't know anything, Joffrey, and neither do you, and spreading Lancel's rumors is going to make everything worse. Joffrey's smirk hardened. The hardening was the expression of a boy who was afraid and who covered fear with aggression and who would, if unchecked, convert every fear into a cruelty inflicted on someone weaker. If it's true, Joffrey said, then you're the only real prince. And we're nothing. Is that what you want? Nobody wants that. Then make Stark stop. I can't make Stark stop. He's the hand of the king. You're the prince. The heir. Command him. That's not how it works. Joffrey left. The departure was a storm in miniature. The boy's anger following him through the yard like a wake, the squires stepping aside with the practiced avoidance of boys who had learned that Joffrey's moods were dangerous and that proximity to dangerous moods was a risk. Stefan stood in the yard and felt the ground shifting beneath his family, the tectonic movement of secrets surfacing. And the boy who had been secure in his identity, the heir, the prince, the son of Robert Baratheon, felt the security trembling. Ned found the proof that Robert demanded through a channel he had not expected. Stannis Baratheon. Stannis came to King's Landing. The Lord of Dragonstone sailed into Blackwater Bay with 5 ships and a letter that said, I have information relevant to Lord Arryn's investigation. I will present it to the king. The brevity was pure Stannis, a man who used language the way a miser used gold, spending as little as possible and expecting full value for every word. Stannis's information was the piece that Ned's investigation lacked. Jon Arryn had shared his findings with Stannis before his death. Stannis had continued the investigation independently, and the investigation had produced a witness, a former handmaiden of Cersei's, dismissed from service 2 years earlier, who had seen Cersei and Jaime together in circumstances that were not circumstantial. The handmaiden's testimony was delivered to Robert in the small council chamber, with Ned and Stannis present and the doors closed, and the guards ordered to admit no one. The woman, middle-aged, frightened, speaking in the halting sentences of a servant who understood that her testimony was either her salvation or her death warrant, described what she had seen. The Queen and the Kingslayer. In the Queen's chambers, on a night when the King was hunting, in a position and a state that admitted no innocent interpretation. Robert listened. His face went white, then red, then a colour that had no name. The colour of a man whose world was being disassembled around him while he sat in a chair and listened to a servant describe his wife's adultery with her twin brother. When? Robert's voice was gravel. 3 years passed. Your Grace. Before my dismissal. I was dismissed because the Queen suspected I had seen. When? What month? The 10th month. Your Grace. I remember because the Queen was celebrating Prince Tommen's name day. Tommen's name day. Robert's hands were on the table. The hands were shaking, the tremor of a man whose physical strength was being redirected by emotions that the strength could not contain. She was celebrating our son's name day. And she was, Robert. Ned's voice was low. Steady, there's more. More. Stannis spoke. His voice was the opposite of Robert's, controlled, precise, devoid of the emotional turbulence that Robert radiated. I have conducted my own investigation into the colouring of every Baratheon Lannister union in the historical record. Lord Stark has done the same. The pattern is unbroken. Every child of such a union is black-haired. Stefan is black-haired. The other three are not. Combined with the handmaiden's testimony, the conclusion is unavoidable. Robert stood. The standing was volcanic, the eruption of a man whose stillness had been the pressurized containment of rage rather than calm. Bring me Cersei. The confrontation was not a trial. It was not a conversation. It was the collision of Robert's rage with Cersei's composure, and the collision produced an outcome that no one in the room had anticipated. Cersei denied nothing. The denial had been her plan: deny, redirect, manipulate. But when she stood before Robert with the handmaiden's testimony presented, and the historical evidence arrayed, and Stannis' cold eyes fixed on her with the satisfaction of a man whose patience had been vindicated, Cersei abandoned the plan. She abandoned it because the plan required credibility, and credibility required that the audience believe the denial was possible, and the audience, Robert, Ned, Stannis, did not believe. The evidence was too strong. The denial would be humiliating rather than effective. And Cersei, whose pride was the core around which her personality was organized, chose defiance over humiliation. Yes, Cersei said. Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen are James' children. They are mine and James, not yours. Never yours. The room went silent. The silence was the absence of expectation, the vacuum created by a woman who had been expected to deny and who had confirmed instead, and whose confirmation had removed the flaw from under every person present. Robert's hand went to his warhammer. The warhammer, the weapon that had killed Rhaegar Targaryen, the weapon that Robert kept in his chambers as a reminder of the man he had been, was not in the room. The hand closed on air. The closing was the gesture of a man whose instinct was violence, and whose instinct was thwarted by the absence of the instrument. Jaime. Robert said. Where is Jaime? He left the city this morning. He's riding for Casterly Rock. The information was Cersei's final move, the evacuation of the co-conspirator before the confrontation. The extraction of the one person whose presence in the Red Keep would have resulted in immediate death. Jaime was gone. The Golden Children remained, but the father of the Golden Children was beyond Robert's reach. The children, Robert said. His voice was strange, hollow. The voice of a man whose rage had passed through heat and arrived at cold, the dangerous cold of a man making decisions without emotion because the emotions had been burned away. What do I do with the children? The children are innocent, Ned said. They did not choose their parents. They are not responsible for the Queen's crimes. They are abominations, born of incest, living lies. They are children. Joffrey is 11, Myrcella is 9. Tommen is 7. Whatever their parentage, they are children. And Stefan is your son, your legitimate heir. Stefan is not affected by this. Robert looked at Ned. The look was the look of a man who was drowning and who was being offered a single handhold. The black-haired boy. The real son. The heir who was untouched by the scandal because the heir's legitimacy was proven by the same evidence that disproved the Golden Children's. Stefan, Robert said. The name was a lifeline. Stefan is mine. Stefan is yours. The resolution was brutal. Cersei was arrested, confined to her chambers, stripped of her title, guarded by Stark men whom Ned trusted more than the Kingsguard. Jaime Lannister was declared a traitor and stripped of his white cloak. The 3 Golden Children were declared bastards, stripped of their princely titles, stripped of their place in the succession, reduced from the children of a king to the children of a scandal. The reduction was Stannis' insistence. The Lord of Dragonstone, whose commitment to the law was absolute and whose interpretation of the law was merciless, demanded that the illegitimate children be publicly declared bastards and removed from the line of succession. Ned argued for mercy, for quiet removal, for exile to Casterly Rock, for a resolution that punished the guilty without destroying the innocent. The argument was between Ned's compassion and Stannis' legalism, and the resolution was a compromise that satisfied neither. The children were declared bastards, but granted safe passage to Casterly Rock, where they would live under Tywin Lannister's protection, and where their future would be determined by the political negotiations that would follow. Steffan watched from the gallery as his mother was led through the Red Keep in chains. He did not cry. He did not speak. He stood at the railing with his hands gripping the stone and his face showing nothing. And the nothing was not composure, but shock, the blank expression of a boy whose world had been destroyed, and who was processing the destruction at a speed that his mind could not match. His mother was an adulteress. His siblings were bastards. His father's marriage was a lie. And he, the black-haired boy, the legitimate son, the heir, was the proof of all of it. His existence confirmed the accusation. His colouring convicted his mother. The son that Cersei had given Robert was the weapon that Robert used to destroy her. Steffan was 14, and he was alone. You. The lion wakes. You. The raven reached Casterly Rock 3 days after Cersei's arrest. Tywin Lannister read the message in his solar, standing at the window that overlooked the sunset sea, and the sea's indifference to the news was a rebuke to the storm building inside the man who read it. His daughter, arrested, his grandchildren, declared bastards. His son Jaime, declared a traitor, stripped of the white cloak, riding home with the speed of a man whose life depended on the distance he could put between himself and a king's fury. His house, humiliated, the word landed harder than the others. Because Tywin Lannister could survive the loss of children, grandchildren, gold, and men, he could not survive the loss of dignity. Jaime arrived at the Rock 2 days later, road-worn and wild-eyed, and still in the gold armor that he had worn for 15 years as a knight of the Kingsguard. He dismounted in the courtyard and found his father waiting. Not in the courtyard, because Tywin did not greet people. People came to him. But in the solar where the conversation would happen on Tywin's terms, in Tywin's silence, beneath the weight of Tywin's judgment. Father, sit. Jaime sat. The sitting was not obedience. Jaime obeyed Tywin the way a river obeyed a dam, through the application of overwhelming force rather than consent, but the recognition that he had nothing to say that his father would accept standing up. Tell me what happened. Jaime told him. The telling was a confession stripped of contrition, the account of a man who had loved his sister and fathered her children and lost everything because a dead hand of the king had read a book and because a servant had looked through a door she should have walked past. Jaime did not apologize. Jaime's relationship with apology was adversarial. He considered remorse a weakness and the expression of remorse a humiliation, and the distinction between the two was the architecture of his character. Tywin listened. The listening was Tywin's weapon, the silence that forced the speaker to fill the void with more information than they intended to share. The patience that was not patience, but pressure. When Jaime finished, Tywin spoke. You fool. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Tywin's voice carried the weight of a man whose authority derived not from volume, but from the certainty that every word he spoke had been selected from a range of alternatives, and that the selected word was the most precise and the most devastating. Father, you were the finest swordsman in the 7 kingdoms. You were a knight of the Kingsguard. You were my heir, the heir I was denied when you took the white cloak, the heir I spent 15 years trying to reclaim. And you squandered it. Not on ambition, not on rebellion, on lust, on your sister. You destroyed the legacy of House Lannister for a woman who shares your face. I love her. Love. Tywin pronounced the word the way a maester pronounced the name of a disease, with clinical precision and undisguised contempt. Love is the argument children use when they lack better ones. You have destroyed your family. You have humiliated your house. You have given the Baratheon dynasty the power to strip the Lannister name from the succession. And your defense is love." Jaime said nothing. The nothing was the only response that Tywin's contempt permitted, because any words Jaime offered would be additional ammunition for a man who did not need more. "The children," Tywin said. "Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen. Where are they? Robert has declared them bastards. Ned Stark negotiated safe passage to the Rock. They should arrive within the fortnight. And Cersei? Arrested, confined to her chambers. Stark's men guarding her." Tywin turned to the window. The sunset sea stretched beneath the rock in the fading light, the water catching the last gold of the sun in a display that poets would have found meaningful and that Tywin found irrelevant. His mind was operating at the level where emotion was a variable to be managed rather than experienced. The analytical remove that had made him the most feared lord in the Seven Kingdoms and the most effective hand the Seven Kingdoms had ever produced. The situation was this: his daughter faced execution or exile. His grandchildren had been stripped of their birthright. His son was a declared traitor. The Lannister name, the name that Tywin had spent 40 years building into a synonym for power, was covered in filth. And the only question that mattered was not how to wash the filth away, but how to turn the filth into a weapon. "Robert will want a trial," Tywin said. "Or an execution. Robert will want a trial because Stark will insist on one. Stark is an honorable man, which means he is a predictable man, and predictable men insist on trials, because trials are the ritual through which honorable men sanctify the violence they want to commit. There will be a trial. The question is whether we can win it." "We can't. The handmaidens saw us. Cersei confessed. Cersei confessed because Cersei's pride is larger than her intelligence. A confession can be recanted. A witness can be discredited. Evidence can be reinterpreted. Nothing in this situation is irreversible, except the Baratheon boy. Stefan. The legitimate heir, the boy whose existence proves the accusation. Because the boy is black-haired and your children are not, and the contrast is the prosecution's case in a single image. As long as Stefan exists, the evidence against Cersei is written in flesh." Jaime's face changed. The change was not subtle. It was the raw reconfiguration of a man who had heard an implication in his father's words, and who was recoiling from the implication before his conscious mind had finished processing it. "Father, you cannot. I did not say what you think I said. Stefan is the king's son. Harming the king's son is not strategy, it is suicide. I am describing the problem, not prescribing a solution." "Then what is the solution?" "The solution is power. The solution is always power. Robert sits the Iron Throne because he had the power to take it. He keeps it because he has the power to hold it. And power is not sentiment. Power is the capacity to make your enemy's position more expensive than their position is worth. Robert has declared our grandchildren bastards. Very well. What does Robert need? Gold. The Crown's debt to House Lannister is 3 million dragons. The debt to the Iron Bank is 2 million more. The Seven Kingdoms are solvent because Lannister gold keeps them solvent. If I withdraw the gold, the Crown collapses. You would bankrupt the kingdom? I would make it clear that the kingdom's prosperity depends on Lannister cooperation. Robert is not a man who thinks about finance. Stark is not a man who understands it. When the treasury empties and the soldiers' pay stops and the small folk begin to starve, they will discover that humiliating House Lannister carries costs that exceed the satisfaction. Tywin called his banners. Not for war, not yet, not openly, but for the demonstration of readiness that was, in the language of Westerosi power, indistinguishable from a declaration of intent. 20,000 Lannister soldiers assembled in the Westerlands. Supply trains rolled west from the Reach, redirected by Lannister gold from the capital's markets to the Rock's granaries. The economic isolation was systematic. Debts called in, loans denied, trade routes redirected. The financial infrastructure that kept King's Landing fed and functioning steadily strangled by the hands that had built it. The message was not delivered by Raven. The message was delivered by absence. the absence of gold, the absence of grain, the absence of the Lannister contribution that had sustained Robert's government for 15 years. The absence said, "We have been insulted. The insult has a price. Name the price or pay the consequences." Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, delivered the terms to King's Landing. Kevan was the diplomat that Tywin was not, softer in manner, gentler in approach, capable of the courtesies that Tywin considered beneath him. The terms were the terms of a man who was negotiating from strength while pretending to negotiate from grief. The Queen to be released to Lannister custody. The children to retain their status as legitimate offspring of the Queen, even if removed from the succession. The Kingslayer to be pardoned and returned to his position, or, failing that, returned to Casterly Rock without the traitor's declaration. "These are my brother's terms," Kevan told Ned in the Hans Solar. He offers them not as demands, but as the foundation for a resolution that preserves the peace. The Queen confessed to treason. The children are not Robert's. These are not matters for negotiation. Everything is a matter for negotiation, Lord Stark. The question is what you are willing to pay for the luxury of your principles. Ned studied Kevan. The study was the evaluation of a man who recognized that the opponent across the table was not the real opponent. The real opponent was at Casterly Rock, behind 20,000 swords and 3 million dragons in debt that the crown could not repay. "I will present your terms to the king." Robert heard the terms and threw a cup of wine against the wall. The cup shattered. The wine ran down the stone like blood. Robert's response was concise. "Tell Tywin Lannister that his terms can go to the 7 hells." His daughter confessed. His son ran. His grandchildren are bastards. And if Tywin Lannister wants a war, I will give him a war that will make the reigns of Castamere look like a border skirmish. The response was Robert at his most Robert, the raw fury of a man whose emotions ran as deep as they ran hot. The warrior's instinct to meet force with force, the king's refusal to negotiate under threat. The response was also exactly what Tywin had anticipated. Because Tywin understood Robert the way a surgeon understood an organ, from the inside, by function, without sentiment. Tywin was not ready for war. Robert was not ready for war. The kingdom existed in the space between two men's prides, the gap between Tywin's refusal to accept humiliation and Robert's refusal to concede to threats. The gap was the peace. The gap was narrowing. The boy in the middle. Steffan visited his mother. The visit was not permitted. Ned had restricted access to the Queen's chambers to guards, maesters, and the Hand himself, but Steffan was the prince. And the guards at Cersei's door were men who had watched the prince grow up, and the prince's grief was visible in a way that made refusal feel like cruelty. They let him through. Cersei was seated by the window. The chamber was comfortable. Ned had not confined her to the dungeons, because Ned's honor extended even to the treatment of prisoners. But the comfort was the comfort of a cage, and the woman inside the cage was diminished, not broken. Cersei did not break. But the gold in her hair seemed duller, and the composure that had been her armor showed cracks that the armor had never shown before. Steffan, mother, he stood in the doorway. The distance between them was 6 feet and 14 years, the physical space of the room and the emotional space of a childhood spent in the shadow of her preference for the golden children. He did not cross the room. She did not stand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Are you? I'm a queen in a cage. I've been better." "You're not a queen anymore." The words were not cruel. They were accurate. And the accuracy was what made them land. The flat statement of a boy who had inherited his father's directness and who had not yet learned that directness was a choice rather than a default. "I am always a queen. They can take the title. They cannot take what I am. What you are is a woman who lied to her husband, who made bastards and passed them off as princes, who let father love children that weren't his, who let me," his voice cracked. The crack was the first fissure in the composure that he had been maintaining since the day of the confrontation, and the fissure opened a channel that he could not close. "Who let me grow up beside them, who let me love them, who let me think they were my brothers and sister. And they're not. They're half. They're Jaime's. And you never told me. What would I have told you? That your mother was a sinner? That your siblings were? You could have told me the truth. The truth would have killed you. Or killed them. Or killed all of us. The truth was a weapon, Stefan, and I kept it sheathed because drawing it would have destroyed everything. Everything is destroyed anyway. Cersei looked at her son. The black-haired boy. The legitimate one. The child she had never loved the way she loved the Golden Three, and the recognition of that failure was visible in her face, not as guilt, because Cersei did not process failure as guilt, but as calculation. She had invested her love in the wrong children, and the investment had returned nothing, and the child she had neglected was the one standing in front of her. You survived, she said. You will always survive. You are a Baratheon and a Lannister, and you have the strengths of both and the weaknesses of neither. The Golden Children are my punishment. You are my legacy. I don't want to be your legacy. You don't get to choose. Legacies are imposed, not selected. You will be king. And when you are king, you will understand that every decision I made, every lie, every sin, every manipulation, was made to protect my children. All of them. Even you. Especially not me. The words hung between them. Stefan turned and left. The door closed behind him with the finality of a period at the end of a sentence that could not be unwritten. He went to the godswood. The southern godswood, with its oaks and elms and the absence of the old gods that his father's family did not worship, and that his mother's family did not acknowledge. He sat beneath the heart tree, an oak, ancient and broad, without the face that the weirwoods of the north carried, and he thought about what it meant to be the legitimate son of a family that was tearing itself apart. Sansa Stark found him there. The red-haired girl was 13, a year younger than Stefan, betrothed to him by their father's agreement, and possessed of the formal courtesy that northern upbringing and Southron ambition had combined to produce. She was pretty in the way that 13-year-old girls were pretty, the promise of beauty rather than its fulfillment, the features not yet settled into the arrangement that adulthood would provide. Your Grace, she said. My father said you might be here. Your father sent you? He suggested I might want to walk in the godswood. He did not say you would be here. But I think he knew. Stefan looked at her. The looking was not the looking of a boy who understood romance. Stefan was 14, and his romantic education consisted of fumbled interactions with serving girls and the theoretical instruction that maesters provided. But the looking of a boy who was lonely and who was recognizing, in the girl's presence, the possibility of company that did not come weighted with agenda. Do you know what's happened? He asked. Everyone knows. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Sorry is for accidents. This was deliberate. Sansa sat beside him. The sitting was brave, the act of a girl who had been raised on stories of chivalry and courtly love, and who was discovering that the reality of courts was less romantic and more devastating than the stories had promised. She did not touch him. She did not offer wisdom. She sat with him in the godswood and provided the comfort of proximity, the ancient human medicine of being present while someone suffered. My father says you're brave, she said. Your father is kind. My father doesn't speak because words are kind. He speaks because words are true. Stefan allowed himself to feel the warmth of the observation. The warmth was small, a candle in a castle, a single point of heat in a structure that was freezing. But the candle was there, and the girl who held it was there, and the presence of both was enough to prevent the cold from becoming total. They sat in the godswood until the shadows lengthened, and the light turned amber, and the castle's evening routines began. The sounds of horses and kitchens and guards changing. The rhythm of a household that continued to function while the family it served fell apart. Ooh, ooh, ooh. The Queen's trial. The trial of Queen Cersei Lannister was held in the Great Hall of the Red Keep on the first day of the 8th month of the year, and the hall was full. Robert sat the Iron Throne. The blades that composed the throne, the 1,000 swords of Aegon's enemies, melted and twisted into the seat of power, rose behind the king like a crown of iron thorns, and Robert's bulk filled the seat with the authority that physical presence conferred and that Robert's character sometimes undermined. Today the character matched the seat. Robert was sober. Robert was cold. Robert was the king. Ned stood at the king's right hand. The position was symbolic. The hand of the king, the right arm, the instrument through which the king's will was executed. And the symbol was accurate, because Ned had organized the trial, and Ned had assembled the evidence, and Ned had argued, against Robert's initial impulse, that the trial should happen at all. Robert had wanted execution. Ned had insisted on process. The realm must see justice, Ned had told Robert, not vengeance. Justice, if you execute her without a trial, you become the tyrant that Aerys was. If you try her, and the evidence condemns her, you become the king who upheld the law. The difference is the trial. Robert had agreed, not because he valued process, but because he valued Ned's opinion, and Ned's opinion was the last opinion in the world that Robert trusted. Stannis sat at the king's left, Lord of Dragonstone, master of ships, the brother whose rigidity was both an asset and a liability. Stannis had prepared the legal framework for the trial with the thoroughness that characterized everything Stannis did. The charges enumerated, the evidence organized, the procedures established, the outcome predetermined by the weight of facts that no defense could counter. The lords and ladies of the court filled the hall. Varys sat on the small council bench with the serene expression of a man who had anticipated every development and who was observing the trial the way a naturalist observed a predator consuming its prey, with interest, without empathy, cataloguing the behaviors for future reference. Petyr Baelish sat beside Varys with the subtle smile that meant he was profiting from the chaos, though the nature of the profit would not become clear until later. Cersei was brought before the court in chains. The chains were not heavy, Ned had insisted on that, but they were visible, and the visibility was the point. The Queen of the Seven Kingdoms in chains, the daughter of Tywin Lannister in irons. The spectacle was its own argument, and the argument was, the law applies to everyone. Cersei stood before the Iron Throne and looked up at the man she had married, and the man she had betrayed, and the throne she had wanted, and the hall full of people who had courted her favor and who were now watching her destruction with the appetite that spectators brought to public. Suffering. She did not flinch. The absence of flinching was Cersei's final weapon. The composure that said, "You may destroy me, but you will not see me break." The charges were read: treason against the crown through adultery with Sir Jaime Lannister, the production of illegitimate children presented as heirs to the Iron Throne, the corruption of the line of succession. Each charge was a sentence, and each sentence was a brick. And the bricks were building a wall between Cersei and any future that included freedom. The evidence was presented: the handmaiden's testimony, the historical record of Baratheon Lannister unions, the colouring of Robert's acknowledged bastards, the physical comparison of Steffon, black-haired, blue-eyed, Baratheon, with Joffrey, Myrcella and Tommen, golden-haired, green-eyed, Lannister. Each piece of evidence was another brick. The wall was becoming complete. Cersei was offered the opportunity to speak in her own defense. She took it. I have heard the charges. I have seen the evidence. I have nothing to say in my defense, because I have nothing to defend. I loved my brother. I bore his children. The 3 golden children are mine and Jaime's, conceived in love and born in defiance of a marriage I did not choose, and a husband I did not want. The hall was silent. The silence was not the silence of sympathy. It was the silence of spectators watching a woman set fire to herself, the held breath of a crowd witnessing self-destruction and unable to look away. Robert Baratheon sits on a throne he won through rebellion. He calls himself king. He was a warrior once, and perhaps a good one, but he has not been a warrior for 15 years. He has been a drunk, a lecker, a whoremonger, and an absent father to every child in the 7 kingdoms, including his own. I married a hero, and I lived with a disappointment. And when the disappointment became unbearable, I found love where I could. Robert's face was stone. The stone concealed the volcano, but the concealment was visible. The effort of a man forcing himself to sit still while his wife catalogued his failures before the court. You ask me to defend myself. I do not defend. I state. These are my crimes. I committed them. I do not regret the children they produced. I regret only the weakness that allowed me to be caught, and the stupidity of a kingdom that discovers the truth 15 years late and calls it justice. The speech was Cersei's finest and most destructive creation, a confession that was simultaneously an indictment, an admission of guilt that doubled as an attack on the man passing judgment. The speech accomplished nothing that could be measured in legal terms. She was guilty. She admitted she was guilty. The verdict was certain. But the speech accomplished its purpose in the currency that Cersei valued above law. It established that she was not a victim. She was an agent. She had chosen her path, and the path had led here, and the arrival was her responsibility and not her shame. The verdict was guilty. The verdict was unanimous. The 7 judges, lords selected by the king. Lords whose politics varied, but whose assessment of the evidence did not, declared Cersei Lannister guilty of treason, adultery, and the corruption of the royal succession. The sentence was Robert's to deliver. The king stood from the Iron Throne and looked down at his wife, the woman he had married for political alliance. The woman he had never loved, because his love was buried on a hill in Dorne with a girl named Lyanna, the woman who had given him 1 true son and 3 golden lies. Cersei Lannister, you are found guilty. The penalty for treason is death. The word fell on the hall like a hammer. Death, the word that had been expected, and that still shocked when spoken, because the distance between expecting an outcome and hearing it declared was the distance between theory and reality. However, Robert's voice changed. The change was the intervention of Ned Stark, visible not in the words, but in the modulation, the tempering of rage into something that resembled statecraft. Ned had spent 3 nights arguing with Robert about the sentence. Ned had argued that executing Cersei would trigger a war with Tywin that the kingdom could not afford, that killing the mother of Jaime's children would make Jaime a martyr's companion, that mercy was not weakness, but strategy. However, the mother of a prince, even a disgraced queen, is owed a measure of mercy that common traitors are not. The sentence is exile. Cersei Lannister will be returned to Casterly Rock under guard. She will not leave the Westerlands. She will not communicate with the court. She will live out her days under her father's roof and under the crown's surveillance. And if she is found to have violated these terms, if she conspires, if she plots, if she acts in any way against the crown, the original sentence will be carried out. Cersei heard the sentence. Exile, not death. The reprieve should have produced relief, but Cersei's face showed nothing that could be called relief. Instead, the face showed the calculation of a woman assessing the sentence for opportunities. Exile to Casterly Rock. Under Tywin's roof. Under Tywin's influence. With Tywin's army around her and Tywin's gold beneath her, the exile was not a punishment. The exile was a positioning. And both Cersei and Tywin recognized it, even if the men who had imposed it did not. I accept the king's mercy, Cersei said, and the words were the most dangerous she had spoken all day, because they were a lie dressed as compliance, a dagger hidden in a handshake. The weeks that followed Cersei's exile were the hardest weeks of Stephen Baratheon's young life. His mother was gone. Escorted west by 50 Stark soldiers and a maester and the 3 golden children, Joffrey raging, Myrcella weeping, Tommen too young to understand, and therefore the only one whose pain was honest, Cersei's departure from King's Landing was a procession that inverted every royal departure that had preceded it. No banners, no cheering, no ceremonial farewell. A disgraced queen leaving a city that had already forgotten her in favor of the next scandal. Steffon watched from the battlements. He did not wave. Cersei, riding in the wheelhouse that had been stripped of royal insignia, did not look up. His father was worse. Robert, freed from the marriage that had been his cage, did not respond to freedom the way that freed men were supposed to respond, with relief, with vitality, with the energy that liberation provided. Robert responded to freedom the way an addict responded to the removal of his last constraint, by consuming more of everything. More wine, more hunting, more whoring, more absence from the duties that the kingdom required, and that the king's temperament was not designed to fulfill. The decline was not sudden. Robert had been declining for years, the slow erosion of the warrior into the drunkard, the incremental substitution of indulgence for purpose. But Cersei's betrayal accelerated the decline the way a crack accelerated a collapse. Robert drank in the morning now. Robert did not attend council meetings. Robert spent his days in the practice yard, hitting targets with a fury that was not practice, but therapy, and his nights in the company of women whose names he did not learn, and whose presence was not companionship, but anesthesia. The king is unwell, Pycelle said at a council meeting that Robert did not attend. The king is drunk, Stannis corrected. He has been drunk for 15 years. The difference is that he was previously a functioning drunk, and he is now a non-functioning drunk. The distinction is operational, not medical. Ned managed. Managing was what Ned did, the stolid, unglamorous work of governance that kings neglected and that hands performed. The daily decisions about grain shipments and tax revenues and border disputes and the 1,000 small crises that composed the life of a kingdom. Ned managed the realm while Robert drank. Ned managed the treasury while Littlefinger skimmed. Ned managed the Lannister crisis while Tywin maneuvered. The Lannister crisis was not resolved. Cersei's exile had diffused the immediate confrontation. Robert had stopped threatening execution. Tywin had stopped threatening war. But the underlying conflict remained. The crown owed House Lannister 3 million gold dragons. The debt was a weapon that Tywin wielded with the expertise of a man who understood that economic power was more reliable than military power, because economic power operated continuously, while military power operated only when activated. Tywin did not call in the debt. That would have been crude, and Tywin was never crude. Instead, Tywin stopped lending. New loans that the crown required for construction, for the fleet, for the wages of the city watch and the garrison, and the 1,000 other expenses that the kingdom incurred, were denied. The denial was polite, reasonable, justified by the disruption that the royal scandal had caused to Lannister finances. The denial was also devastating. Because the crown's spending exceeded its income by approximately 400,000 dragons per year, and the gap had been filled by Lannister loans that were no longer available. Littlefinger, who had built the Treasury's financial structure on a foundation of Lannister credit, scrambled to replace the funding. The Iron Bank of Braavos was willing to lend, but the Iron Bank's interest rates were higher than Tywin's, and the Iron Bank's patience was shorter. The Tyrells had money, but wanted concessions, a seat on the small council, a betrothal for their daughter Margaery to Prince Stefan, a political influence commensurate with their financial contribution. The Tyrells' ambition was transparent, and the concessions they demanded were incompatible with the Stark Baratheon alliance that the Sansa betrothal represented. Ned wrote to Tywin. The letter was an attempt at negotiation, a Northern Lord's direct approach applied to a situation that required the subtlety of a Southern courtier. Tywin's response was 3 sentences. The terms I offered through my brother remain unchanged. House Lannister seeks the restoration of dignity and the acknowledgement of rights. When the crown is ready to discuss, I am ready to listen. He's waiting, Ned told Robert. He's waiting for you to need him enough to concede. I will never concede to Tywin Lannister. Then the kingdom bleeds gold, until we find another source. Find one. Ned did not find one. There was no alternative source that could replace the Lannister contribution on acceptable terms. The Iron Bank's rates would double the debt within a decade. The Tyrells' demands would restructure the political landscape in ways that neither Ned nor Robert wanted. The only solution was Tywin's cooperation. And Tywin's cooperation came at a price that Robert's pride refused to pay. Stefan watched the negotiations from the periphery. He was not admitted to council meetings. He was 14, a prince, but not yet a councillor. But he listened at doors and read the ravens that crossed his father's desk and absorbed the political education that the crisis was providing. The education was harsh. The education said, "Power is not the throne you sit on, power is the gold that keeps the throne standing." He went to Ned with a proposal. "What if I wrote to my grandfather?" Ned looked up from the correspondence that occupied most of his waking hours. The look was assessing, the evaluation of a boy who was demonstrating initiative, and the question of whether the initiative was helpful or harmful. "What would you write?" "I would write that I am his grandson. That I love my mother, whatever she has done. That the golden children, Joffrey, Myrcella, Tommen, are my siblings regardless of their parentage, and that I do not wish to rule a kingdom that treats half my family as enemies." You would appeal to Tywin's affection. I would appeal to Tywin's interest. He wants his legacy protected. I am part of his legacy, his daughter's son, his grandson. If I acknowledge the relationship, publicly, clearly, then Tywin's legacy includes the Iron Throne regardless of what has happened to Cersei. Ned studied the boy. 14 years old. The black-haired son of a man who solved problems with a warhammer and a woman who solved problems with manipulation. And the boy was proposing a solution that was neither violence nor manipulation but diplomacy. The art of giving your opponent what they needed in a form that also served your interests. "Jon Arryn taught you well," Ned said. "Jon Arryn taught me that a king who cannot talk to his enemies will eventually have to fight them. And that fighting costs more than talking. Write the letter. I'll review it before it's sent." Steffon wrote to Tywin Lannister. The letter was remarkable for a boy of 14, clear, dignified, emotionally precise, without being sentimental. It acknowledged Tywin as his grandfather. It expressed grief for his mother's exile. It stated his intention to maintain the relationship between the Crown and Casterly Rock. It did not apologize for the trial or the verdict. It did not concede anything that Robert had won. It offered nothing except the prince's own hand, the personal connection that Tywin could not reject without rejecting his own bloodline. Tywin's response arrived 3 weeks later. The response was longer than his previous communication, 5 sentences instead of 3. And the additional length was, in the language of Tywin Lannister, a significant concession. "I have received the prince's letter. The boy writes well and thinks clearly. He is his mother's son in the ways that matter, and his father's son in the ways that serve. House Lannister acknowledges Prince Steffon as the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, and as a member of our blood. I will consider the prince's words and respond to the hand of the king with revised terms." The revised terms arrived a month later. They were less than Tywin's initial demands, and more than Robert wanted to concede. Cersei's exile was accepted. The Golden Children's bastard status was accepted, on the condition that they retain the surname Lannister, rather than the bastard surname Hill. Jaime's traitor designation would be reduced to dismissal from the Kingsguard with no further penalty. And the Lannister loans would be restructured, not forgiven, but extended, with reduced interest and flexible terms that gave the crown room to breathe. Robert resisted. Ned counseled acceptance. Steffon, who was not asked but who was present, said nothing, and the nothing was eloquent. The silence of a boy who had made the opening move, and who understood that the negotiation required his father's participation, and not his. Robert accepted. The acceptance was grudging, bitter, accompanied by language that would have been unsuitable for a raven, and that was delivered instead to the walls of Robert's chambers at a volume that the servants on the floor below could hear. But the acceptance was real, and the terms were signed. And the Lannister crisis, the immediate crisis, the crisis of gold and armies and threatened war, was diffused. The deeper crisis remained. The family was broken. The kingdom was wounded, and the boy who had negotiated the peace was carrying, on his 14-year-old shoulders, the weight of responsibilities that should not have been his for another decade. The king's decline. Robert Baratheon died on a hunt. The death was ordinary. A boar, a spear, too much wine. The animal turning at the last moment and catching the king in the side with a tusk that opened the royal body from hip to armpit. The death was Robert's death. The warrior's end that Robert had wanted. The combat that was not combat. but consequence. The final encounter between a man who had been the strongest fighter in the Seven Kingdoms and the entropy that had been eroding him for 15 years. But the death was not an accident. Varys knew. The Spider had watched Cersei's exile with the detachment of a man whose plans operated on timescales that individual events could not disrupt. The exile sent Cersei to Casterly Rock. The Golden Children accompanied her. The crisis was resolved. But Varys had watched Tywin's response to the crisis with the attention that a man who served the realm, or served whatever Varys served, brought to the movements of the most dangerous man in the Seven Kingdoms. And Varys had watched Lancel Lannister. Lancel was Robert's squire, a Lannister cousin, golden-haired, eager to please, positioned in the king's household before the scandal and retained afterward because removing every Lannister from the Red Keep would have been impractical, and because Robert, in his contempt for details, had not bothered to dismiss a boy whose surname should have disqualified him from the position. Lancel kept the king's wine. Lancel filled the king's cup. And on the day of the hunt, Lancel filled the cup with fortified arbor gold, triple strength, sweet enough to mask the potency, sufficient to turn the king's habitual drunkenness into incapacitation. Varys did not intervene. The non-intervention was Varys's specialty, the decision to allow events to proceed that served his purposes, the passive complicity that was indistinguishable from ignorance, and that was far more dangerous. Ned was not in King's Landing when the hunt occurred. Ned had ridden north to attend to a border dispute between the Umbers and the Boltons, a minor matter that required the Hand's personal attention because the families involved were too proud to accept adjudication from a lesser authority. The absence was coincidental, or it was orchestrated. Varys was not the only player whose moves preceded the event, and the question of whether Littlefinger had encouraged the border dispute through agents, through whispers, through the gentle manipulation of proud northern lords into unnecessary confrontation, was a question that would never be answered, because the answer served no one's interest. Robert was brought back to the Red Keep on a litter. The king was dying, the wound too deep, the blood loss too severe, the years of drinking having weakened the body that the boar had opened. The maesters could not save him. The maesters were honest about this, which was, for maesters, an unusual display of candor. Stefan was at his father's bedside. The prince, 14, almost 15 now, months past the crisis that had destroyed his family, knelt beside the bed where the king was dying and held his father's hand and did not weep because the tears were blocked by a sensation that was larger than grief, the recognition that the hand he held was the last anchor connecting him to the life he had known, and that when the hand went cold the life would be gone. Stefan, Robert's voice was a ruin, the bellow reduced to a whisper, the power leaked out through the wound that was killing him. "My boy." "I'm here, father. Ned." "Where's Ned?" "He's riding south. He'll be here soon." "Not soon enough." Robert coughed. The cough produced blood. The blood was the color of the wine he had been drinking when the boar charged. Dark, almost black. The final commentary of a body that had consumed too much and that was now consuming itself. "Listen, you're the king now. Or you will be." Stefan Baratheon, first of his name. "Father, don't tell me don't. I'm dying. I'm allowed to talk." "Listen." The hand that held Stefan's tightened. The grip was weak, a fraction of the grip that had swung a warhammer on the trident, but the weakness made the grip more urgent. Because the man delivering the message knew that the time for delivery was almost over. Trust Ned. Ned is the one honest man in this city. Trust Ned, and don't trust anyone else. Not Varys, not Littlefinger, not Pycelle. Ned, only Ned. What about Stannis? Stannis is your uncle, and he is loyal to the law. The law says you are king. Stannis will support you. But Stannis does not know how to bend, and a king who cannot bend will break. Ned knows how to bend without breaking. Trust Ned. I will. And Stefan, the Golden Children, you're the other ones. They are children. They didn't choose this. Whatever happens, remember that. I remember. Robert died in the hour before dawn. The death was quiet. The warrior's end was not the warrior's death, but the sick man's death. The fading rather than the fall. The candle guttering rather than the flame extinguished. Robert Baratheon, first of his name, king of the Andals and the Rhoynar and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms, protector of the realm, died in a bed that smelled of blood and wine and the accumulated failures of a reign that should have been glorious and that was merely long. Steffon did not leave the room. He stayed beside his father's body until the maesters came to prepare it. And then he went to the throne room, and then he stood before the Iron Throne, the seat of Aegon, the seat of kings, the seat that his father had won through rebellion and held through neglect, and that was now, by blood and law and the absence of alternatives, his. He did not sit. The sitting would come later, with ceremony and oaths and the formal mechanisms of succession. For now, he stood in the empty throne room in the grey light of dawn and felt the weight of the crown he had not yet worn. He was 15 years old. He was the king, and the kingdom he inherited was broke, wounded, distrustful, and surrounded by forces that his father's weakness and his mother's crimes had awakened. The young stag, Ned Stark, arrived in King's Landing 3 days after Robert's death and walked into a succession crisis that was not a crisis because Steffon existed, but that was, in every practical sense, a crisis because Steffon was 15. A boy king. The Seven Kingdoms had experienced boy kings before, and the historical record was not encouraging. Aegon III had ascended at 10 and ruled in the shadow of his regent's ambitions. Daeron I had ascended at 14 and launched a war that killed him at 18. Baelor the Blessed had ascended at 16 and starved himself to death in religious fervor at 26. The precedent said, boy kings were either puppets or zealots, controlled by the men around them, or consumed by the inadequacies within them. The precedent was a warning. But Steffon was not the precedent. Steffon was the boy that Jon Arryn had educated, and that Crisis had matured, and that 14 months of family catastrophe had hardened into something that was not yet a king, but was also not a child. The boy who had written to Tywin Lannister and negotiated a peace. The boy who had watched his mother's trial without breaking. The boy who had held his father's hand while his father died. The hardening was not completeness. 15 was still 15. And the gaps in his experience were visible to anyone who looked, but the hardening was real. And the foundation it provided was stronger than anything the small council had expected. The regency was established by necessity and by law. Ned Stark was named protector of the realm and regent, the role that the dead king's last words had prescribed. Steffon would rule with Ned's council until his 16th name day, at which point the regency would end, and the boy would become the man, and the prince would become the king. Stannis Baratheon was named Master of Ships, a position he already held, and given a seat on the expanded Regency Council that Ned established to broaden the governance beyond the small council's traditional membership. The Regency Council included Ned, Stannis, the new Master of Coin, a merchant from White Harbor named Wyman Manderly's second son, Wylis, who understood commerce the way Littlefinger understood manipulation, but whose understanding was directed at function rather than profit, and Grand Maester Pycelle, whose presence was traditional and whose loyalty was uncertain, but whose removal would have required a formal request to the Citadel that the Regency did not have time to pursue. Littlefinger was removed. The removal was Ned's first act as regent, the dismissal of the man whose management of the treasury had turned the crown's finances into a web of debts, obligations, and leveraged positions that no one could untangle, and that Littlefinger had designed specifically to be untangleable. Littlefinger departed with the graceful acceptance of a man whose plans did not require a position in the capital to operate, and whose network of informants and agents continued to function regardless of his physical location. Varys remained. The spider was impossible to remove. His intelligence network was the kingdom's nervous system, and severing it would have blinded the Regency at a moment when blindness was lethal. Ned distrusted Varys with the fundamental distrust that honest men felt for men whose loyalties were opaque. But distrust was not the same as dismissal, and the information that Varys provided was too valuable to sacrifice on principle. The first months of the regency were administrative. Ned governed, Steffon learned. The learning was not the passive absorption of lectures, it was the active education that came from sitting beside the regent as decisions were made, watching the mechanics of governance, understanding that a kingdom was not a castle but a machine, and that the machine required maintenance, fuel, attention, and repair. Steffon attended every council meeting. He spoke when he had something to say, and was silent when he did not, and the ratio of silence to speech tilted increasingly towards speech as the months passed, and as the boy's understanding deepened. The council members noticed. Stannis, whose approval was expressed through the absence of criticism, stopped correcting the boy's questions. Pycelle, whose loyalty adjusted to power the way a weather vane adjusted to wind, began addressing Steffon with a deference that had previously been reserved for adults. The kingdom stabilized. The Lannister crisis was managed, the restructured terms held, the gold flowed, the debt was serviced. The northern lords pledged loyalty to the new king. The Reach sent emissaries expressing support and subtly probing the question of Marguerite Tyrell's availability as a match for the young king. The Stormlands, Robert's homeland, rallied to his son with the automatic loyalty that blood and precedent commanded. The Riverlands were more complex. The Tullys, Catelyn Stark's family, supported the regency through their connection to Ned. But the Riverlords were always complex, their loyalties fractured by geography and history, their commitment to any cause proportional to the cause's immediate benefit to their lands. Hoster Tully was dying. The succession at Riverrun would pass to Edmure, Catelyn's brother, whose competence was adequate and whose judgment was inconsistent. Dorne was silent. The Martells had their own agenda, the memory of Elia Martell, murdered by the Mountain during the sack of King's Landing, the blood debt that the Dornish held against the Lannisters, and that the Baratheon dynasty's alliance with the Lannisters had extended to include the crown. Dorne's silence was not neutrality. It was waiting. The Iron Islands were restless. Balon Greyjoy, who had rebelled once against Robert and lost, was assessing the new king's strength with the Predator's calculation. Was the young stag weak enough to challenge? The assessment was ongoing. The answer was not yet clear. Steffon married Sansa Stark. The marriage was held on Steffon's 16th name day, the day the regency ended. The day the boy became king in fact, as well as in title. The ceremony was in the Great Sept of Baelor, with the High Septon performing the rites, and the hall was filled with the lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms who had come to witness the transition, and to assess the new king for weaknesses they could exploit and strengths they would need to accommodate. Sansa was 15, tall, red-haired, beautiful in the way that the transition from girl to woman produced in faces that were designed for beauty. The beauty was not the only quality she brought to the marriage. Sansa was smart, trained in the social arts that northern women learned alongside needlework, and possessed of an emotional intelligence that surpassed Steffon's analytical mind and that would, in the years to come, become the complement that made their partnership effective. The marriage was political. The marriage was also, unexpectedly, affectionate. The gods would encounter. The afternoon when Sansa had found Steffon in the wake of his family's destruction and had sat with him without speaking, providing presence rather than advice, had established a foundation that the intervening months had built upon. They were not in love. Love was a luxury that political marriages did not require. But they liked each other, and the liking was rare enough among royal couples to be remarkable, and the remarking was what the court did. The whispered assessment that the young king and his Stark bride were fond of each other, that the fondness was genuine, that the marriage might actually work. The coronation followed the wedding. The ceremony was traditional. The oaths, the crown, the sword, the Seven's blessing. And Steffon spoke the words with a voice that did not shake and a face that did not betray the terror he felt. Because the terror was the appropriate response to what was happening, and the concealment of terror was the first skill that kingship required. King Steffon Baratheon, first of his name, 16 years old, black-haired, blue-eyed, his father's son in body and his mother's son in mind, and Jon Arryn's student in temperament and Ned Stark's proch in governance. He was none of the kings who had preceded him. He was not Robert, who had ruled through charisma and neglect. He was not Aerys, who had ruled through paranoia and fire. He was not Aegon, who had ruled through conquest and dragons. He was Steffon. And Steffon's mode of ruling was something that the Seven Kingdoms had not encountered in a generation: competence. The first test came within a fortnight. Pycelle brought a petition from the Faith Militant, the armed branch of the Faith of the Seven, which had been disbanded for centuries, but which the High Septon was attempting to reconstitute in the aftermath of the royal scandal. The logic was transparent. The Queen's adultery and the incest that had produced 3 illegitimate children was, in the Faith's interpretation, evidence that the monarchy required religious oversight. The militants' restoration would provide that oversight. The provision would also provide the Faith with an army. Steffon denied the petition. The denial was delivered in the small council, with the lords present and the reasoning articulated in language that left no ambiguity. The Faith counsels the soul. The crown governs the realm. These are distinct functions. Combining them benefits neither the soul nor the realm. The petition is denied. Pycelle reported the denial to the High Septon. The High Septon protested. The protest was formal, and the protest was insufficient, because the boy on the throne had spoken with the authority that the throne conferred, and that the Faith could not contest without contesting the throne itself. "The boy has teeth," Stannis observed after the council. It was the closest thing to a compliment that Stannis had ever delivered, and the delivery was so dry that several council members mistook it for criticism. Ned did not mistake it. Ned heard the approval beneath the dryness and allowed himself the private satisfaction of a man whose work was producing results. The boy had teeth. The boy had a crown. And the boy was beginning to demonstrate that the two were compatible. The golden children grew at Casterly Rock in the shadow of their grandfather's expectations and their mother's fury. Joffrey was the problem. The boy had always been the problem. The cruelty that had been a tendency in childhood hardened into a characteristic in adolescence. And the characteristic was fed by the circumstances, the bastard prince, the dispossessed heir. The boy who had been told he was royalty and who had been reduced to the status of a scandal's byproduct. The reduction fermented in Joffrey like poison in a flask, producing not humility but bitterness, not reflection but rage. The toxic transformation of a boy who had been unpleasant when privileged into something dangerous when deprived. Tywin managed Joffrey the way Tywin managed every problem, through control. The boy was given tutors, trainers, a schedule that left little room for the idle brooding that fed his cruelty. The management was effective in the way that containment was effective. The problem did not disappear, but it did not spread. Joffrey learned to fight, learned to ride, learned the letters and numbers and history that a lord's education required. The learning was sullen, performed under duress, absorbed without enthusiasm. But the learning stuck, because Tywin's standards were not optional, and because the consequences of failing to meet them were worse than the effort required to meet them. Myrcella adapted. The girl, golden-haired, gentle, possessed of an intelligence that was quieter than her mother's, but no less acute, processed the displacement with a maturity that surprised even Tywin. She did not rage. She did not grieve conspicuously. She observed. She studied. She became the student that Joffrey refused to be, absorbing the lessons of history and governance and social maneuvering that her grandfather's household provided. Becoming, year by year, the Lannister that Cersei had been before ambition and desire had corroded the potential. Tommen was too young to understand, and remained too young to understand until he was old enough to understand everything at once, the delayed comprehension hitting him at 10, like a wave that had been traveling across an ocean, and that arrived all at once with the accumulated force of years. He was a gentle boy. Too gentle, Cersei said, too soft for the world he had been born into, and the family he belonged to. The softness was not weakness. It was the temperament of a boy whose nature was kindness, and whose environment demanded something harder than kindness. Tywin, who had contempt for softness in the abstract, found himself unable to apply the contempt to a grandson whose eyes were green and trusting, and who followed the old lord through the halls of the Rock with the devotion of a boy who had lost his father, and who was looking for a replacement. Cersei plotted. The plotting was not immediate. The first months at the Rock were consumed by the logistics of exile, the adjustment to reduced circumstances, the management of pride in an environment that was luxurious but constrained. Cersei's quarters at Casterly Rock were larger than her chambers in the Red Keep, her wardrobe more extensive, her meals more elaborate. The gilded cage was more gilded than the previous cage. But the bars were bars regardless of the metal, and Cersei's response to bars was the same response she had always had: scheme until the bars broke. The scheme took shape over years. Cersei's exile prohibited her from communicating with the court, but the prohibition was enforced by distance and surveillance, rather than by physical impossibility. And distance and surveillance were obstacles that money and patience could overcome. Letters moved through intermediaries, merchants, septons, travelers whose routes passed through the Westerlands and whose loyalty was purchasable. The letters went to allies, to contacts, to anyone in the capital whose grievance against the current regime might be converted into useful action. But the scheme lacked a mechanism. Cersei could plot from Casterly Rock. She could cultivate allies. She could nurture grievances. What she could not do was act, could not reach King's Landing, could not touch the crown, could not alter the succession that had placed her firstborn on the throne and that had removed her golden children from it. The mechanism she needed was someone inside the capital. The mechanism she needed was Steffon. Not Steffon as an ally, Steffon as a target. The young king's mercy, the mercy that Robert had promised on his deathbed and that Steffon had inherited along with the crown, was, in Cersei's assessment, a vulnerability. If Steffon could be persuaded to restore the Golden Children's status, not as heirs, not as princes, but as acknowledged Lannister children with titles and lands and a place in the hierarchy, then Cersei's exile would become less exile and more diplomatic residence, and the distance between diplomatic residence and restored influence was a distance that Cersei knew how to cross. The persuasion would come through Tommen, the gentlest child, the one that Steffon, who had loved his siblings before the truth emerged, might still feel affection for. If Tommen wrote to Steffon, if Tommen at 10 asked his brother the king whether his brother the king still remembered him, the emotional leverage might produce a response that political calculation would not. Tywin saw the scheme and said nothing. The saying nothing was not approval, it was the recognition that the scheme was consistent with his own interests, and that Cersei's initiative, for once, was operating in the same direction as Tywin's strategy. If the Golden Children were restored to some status, the Lannister legacy was preserved. If the Lannister legacy was preserved, Tywin's investment was protected. The old lion's ambitions and the caged lioness's desperation were, for the first time, aligned. The letter from Tommen arrived at the Red Keep on a winter morning. The letter was written in a child's hand, careful, uneven, the penmanship of a 10-year-old who had been coached to write clearly and who had succeeded through effort rather than facility. Brother, do you remember when we used to play in the Godswood? You would be the knight, and I would be the squire, and Myrcella would be the princess, and Joffrey would be the dragon. You always won. You always saved the princess. I miss playing. I miss you. Are you well? I hope you are well. Grandfather says you are king now. I do not understand everything that happened, but I know that Mother is sad, and Joffrey is angry, and Myrcella reads all day. And I am writing to you because no one tells me not to. I am your brother. I will always be your brother. Even if they say I am not your brother in the same way. I am your brother. Tommen Steffon read the letter in his solar. He read it twice. He put it down and stared at the wall and felt the old wound open. The wound that had been inflicted when the truth emerged and that had never fully closed. The wound of discovering that the siblings he loved were his half-siblings and that the mother who bore them had lied to everyone including him. Tommen was 10. Tommen was innocent. Tommen was the boy who had followed Steffon through the Red Keep like a shadow, who had laughed when Steffon picked him up, who had cried when Steffon left the room, who had loved his older brother with the uncomplicated devotion that only small children were capable of producing. Stefan wrote back. The letter was brief. The king's correspondence was monitored by the small council, and Stefan knew that any communication with the Golden Children would be scrutinized for political implications. But the letter said what needed to be said. Tommen, I remember. I am well. I hope you are well too. Study hard. Be kind. Be the person that our family needs you to be, not the person that our family's history says you should be. You are my brother. Stefan, the correspondence continued. Monthly letters, innocuous, personal, the exchange of two brothers separated by circumstance and connected by a bond that politics had damaged but not severed. The letters said nothing that the small council could object to. The letters said everything that Cersei needed them to say. The channel was open. The relationship was maintained. The emotional connection that she would later attempt to exploit was being cultivated by the very innocence she was using as a tool. Ned observed the correspondence and said nothing to Stefan. The saying nothing was not negligence. It was the judgment of a man who understood that forbidding a 16-year-old king from writing to his 10-year-old brother would damage the king's trust in his advisor without meaningfully changing the political situation. The letters were monitored. The content was harmless. And the boy's instinct to maintain the relationship was, in Ned's assessment, evidence of the compassion that made Stefan a better man than Robert, and a better king than Aerys, and a better Baratheon than any Baratheon since the first Stefan, who had drowned in Shipbreaker Bay, and whose name the boy carried. But Ned also spoke to Stefan about the letters, not to forbid, to caution. Your compassion does you credit. The letters to Tommen are the act of a good brother. But remember that your brother lives in your grandfather's house, and your grandfather is Tywin Lannister, and Tywin Lannister does nothing without a purpose. I know. Do you? Lord Stark, I am the son of Cersei Lannister. I have spent my entire life learning to distinguish between love and strategy. I love Tommen. But the letters pass through my grandfather's hands before they reach me, and my mother's eyes before they leave the rock. I am not naive. I did not say you were. You were thinking it. I was thinking that you are 16, and that 16-year-olds who believe they are not naive are often the most naive of all. But I was also thinking that Jon Arryn would be proud of you. And that is not a thought I have lightly. Stefan accepted the caution. The acceptance was the mark of the king he was becoming. A man who could hear criticism without defensiveness, who could distinguish between advice and attack, who could hold two contradictory truths simultaneously, that the letters were genuine and that the letters were dangerous. Ooh, 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 ooh. The hand's shadow. Ned Stark served as Hand of the King for the entirety of Stefan's reign, and the serving nearly killed him. Not physically, though the years in King's Landing took a toll that the Northern Lord's constitution was not designed to absorb. The heat and the politics and the daily immersion in an environment that Ned found morally corrosive working on him the way weather worked on stone. Wearing away the surface without changing the shape. The near death was political, and the politics were Littlefingers. Petyr Baelish had departed King's Landing after his dismissal with the grace of a man whose plans did not require proximity to succeed. He had gone to the Eyrie, to Lysa Arryn, the woman he had manipulated into killing her husband, the woman whose love for Baelish was the lever he had used to murder Jon Arryn and destabilize the realm. Lysa's son, Robin, was Lord of the Eyrie, a sickly boy, coddled and strange, the product of a mother's overprotection and a father's absence. Robin's lordship was nominal. Lysa's regency was real. And Lysa's regency was Littlefinger's. From the Eyrie, Baelish wove. The weaving was his art, the creation of networks, alliances, debts, and dependencies that connected him to power without placing him in the visible positions that attracted scrutiny. He whispered to the Vale Lords. He whispered to the River Lords. He whispered to the discontented and the ambitious and the overlooked, the minor houses and the third sons, and the merchants whose wealth exceeded their status and whose status could be purchased by a man who understood the price. The whispering produced a faction, not a rebellion, Baelish was too intelligent for rebellion, which was a loud and visible form of opposition that attracted retaliation. The faction was a lobby, a coordinated effort to influence the young king's policies in directions that served Baelish's interests, a network of voices advocating positions that appeared independent but that originated from a single source. The faction opposed the Stark-Baratheon alliance. The faction advocated for the Golden Children's restoration. The faction whispered that Ned Stark's regency had been unnecessary, that the young king was old enough to govern without a northern lord's supervision, that the North's influence on the crown was disproportionate, and that the balance should be corrected. Varys saw the faction. The spider's network detected the coordinated messaging the way a web detected vibrations, through the pattern, through the frequency, through the regularity that distinguished organized activity from random noise. Varys brought the intelligence to Ned. Lord Baelish is building a coalition against you. Baelish builds coalitions the way other men build houses. It is his occupation. This coalition is larger than his previous constructions. He has the Vale. He has elements of the Riverlands. He has sympathizers among the Crownlands lords who resent northern influence. And he has a message that resonates. The young king should rule without a northern regent. The regency ended. Stefan rules. You are the hand of the king. In function, you are the government. The king acts on your council. The council follows your direction. The distinction between regent and hand is, to the lords who receive Baelish's whispers, invisible, Ned considered. The consideration was the habitual evaluation that Ned performed before acting. The weighing of options, the assessment of consequences, the calculation that men like Varys performed instinctively and that Ned performed through effort. What does Baelish want? Baelish wants chaos. Chaos is the environment in which Baelish thrives. A stable kingdom governed by honest men is Baelish's nightmare, because stability and honesty remove the opportunities that Baelish exploits. If he can destabilize the Stark-Baratheon alliance, if he can drive a wedge between you and the king, between the North and the Crown, the resulting disorder creates the opportunities he needs. And Cersei? Is she connected to Baelish's faction? Cersei's interests and Baelish's interests are temporarily aligned but fundamentally different. Cersei wants restoration, the Golden Children status, her own freedom, the Lannister legacy preserved. Baelish wants destruction, the existing order demolished and rebuilt with himself as architect. They will cooperate until their interests diverge, and the divergence will be violent. Ned took the intelligence to Stefan. The conversation was held in the king's solar, with the doors closed and the guards dismissed, and the two men, the old hand and the young king, speaking with the candor that their relationship permitted. Littlefinger is building a faction against us. Against you, Lord Stark. Not against me. The faction's message is that I should rule without your influence. If the message were against me, the response would be different. The distinction is academic. If the faction succeeds in removing me, the purpose is not to liberate you from my influence. The purpose is to create a vacuum that Baelish fills. Then I should address the faction by making the distinction visible. I should demonstrate that my policies are my own, that I am not your puppet but your ally, and that the alliance is my choice rather than your imposition. Ned studied the young king. 16, the age at which Ned himself had gone to war, the age at which Robert had raised a rebellion, the age at which the history of the Seven Kingdoms was full of boys becoming men through crisis. Stefan was proposing a response that was neither Ned's response nor Robert's response, but something new. A diplomatic maneuver that acknowledged the threat and addressed it through perception rather than force. What do you propose? I propose that the hand of the king is no longer called the hand of the king. I don't understand. You're my advisor, Lord Stark. My counselor, my father's oldest friend, and the man I trust most in the world. I am not proposing that you leave. I am proposing that your role be redefined, publicly, formally, from the authority who governs on my behalf to the counselor who advises at my request. The same man, the same trust, a different title. And the different title removes Baelish's argument. because the argument depends on the perception that I am governed rather than advised. The proposal was shrewd. The proposal was also painful. It required Ned to accept a reduction in authority that was formal rather than real, but that the court would interpret as a diminishment. And the interpretation would be Baelish's victory regardless of the reality. You're asking me to step down. I'm asking you to step sideways. The kingdom's perception changes. Our relationship does not, and if Baelish interprets the change as weakness, then Baelish underestimates the king, which is a miscalculation that I prefer to the correct estimation. Ned agreed. The agreement was the act of a man who recognized that the boy he had mentored had become a king, who was capable of strategic thinking that exceeded the mentor's instincts, and that the capacity was not a threat but a gift. The result of Jon Arryn's education, Cersei's example, Robert's failure, and Ned's guidance, combined in a boy who was becoming a man who might actually be good at the impossible job. The title change was announced. Lord Eddard Stark would serve as Lord Counsellor to the King, a position of trust and influence without the formal authority that the hand of the King traditionally wielded. The small council would report to the King directly. The King would govern with the counsel of his advisors, but the authority of his own judgment. The announcement neutered Baelish's faction. The message that had been resonating, free the king from northern control, lost its force when the king himself demonstrated that the control was advisory rather than authoritative. The faction did not dissolve. Baelish's factions never dissolved. They reformed and regrouped and waited for the next opportunity. But the immediate threat was diffused. Baelish, in the Eyrie, received the news and smiled. The smile was not defeat. It was the recognition that the young king was a more interesting opponent than anticipated, and that interesting opponents required more sophisticated strategies. The game continued. The game always continued. The game was not won or lost, but played. And the playing was, for men like Pettier Baelish, the entire point. The Ironborn and the Rose. Balon Greyjoy attacked the Shield Islands in the second year of Steffen's reign. The attack was predicted. Varys had reported Ironborn movement, Stannis had reinforced the Red Wine fleet, the preparations were in place. But prediction and prevention were different operations, and the Ironborn were masters of the gap between what the continent expected and what the sea delivered. 50 longships struck the Shield Islands in a dawn raid that was over before the Red Wine defenders could organize a response. The islands fell. The Ironborn held them. The attack was a test. Balon Greyjoy was measuring the young king, assessing whether the stag had the warrior's blood or the administrator's caution, whether the boy who sat the Iron Throne would respond with force or negotiation or the paralysis that boy kings sometimes displayed when confronted with their first military challenge. Steffen's response surprised everyone except Ned. The king called a council of war. The council included Stannis, whose naval expertise made him the obvious commander, Ned, whose counsel the king would hear before deciding, the Master of War, a position that Steffen had created by splitting the traditional responsibilities of the Hand into specialized roles, and Sir Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, whose experience in military matters spanned 4 decades and 3 kings. We retake the islands, Steffon said. But we do not invade the Iron Islands. We retake what was taken, and we hold what is ours. The Ironborn want a war, because war is the only economy the Ironborn have. They pay the iron price, because they cannot pay the gold price. We deny them the war they want, while inflicting the defeat they deserve. The Shield Islands are Tyrell territory, Stannis observed. The Tyrells will expect to command the recapture. The Tyrells will participate in the recapture. The command will be yours, Lord Stannis. The fleet is the Crown's fleet. The war is the Crown's war. The Tyrells contribute ships and men. They do not contribute leadership. The decision was strategic and political simultaneously, a military response that addressed the Ironborn threat while managing the Tyrell ambition that had been growing since the regime change. The Tyrells wanted influence. The Tyrells wanted Margaery on the throne. The Tyrells wanted a return on the investment that their geographic position and agricultural wealth entitled them to claim. Steffon's response gave the Tyrells a role without giving them authority. a contribution without a command, the honor of participation without the power of leadership. Mace Tyrell, the Lord of Highgarden, objected. The objection was delivered through his mother, Olenna, the Queen of Thorns, whose reputation for political acuity was matched only by her reputation for devastating candor. The boy denies my son the command of an operation to recapture our own islands, Olenna said to Ned. The conversation was in the gardens at the Red Keep, where Olenna had established herself with the territorial permanence of a matriarch whose physical frailty was inversely proportional to her political strength. Does the boy king understand that the Tyrells feed the realm? The king understands logistics, Lady Olenna. He also understands precedent. If the crown concedes command of military operations to regional lords, the crown's military authority becomes regional rather than national. The Shield Islands are Tyrell territory. The sea is the crown's domain. Distinctions, pretty distinctions. The boy is clever. The boy is the king. So was Robert. Cleverness does not ensure longevity. Robert was not clever. Robert was strong. Stefan is both. Olenna studied Ned with the assessment that the old exercised on the middle-aged, the evaluation of decades compressed into a glance. You believe in this boy? I do. Then you are either the wisest man in the Seven Kingdoms or the most deluded. The difference will be determined by events. Stannis retook the Shield Islands in 3 weeks. The naval campaign was decisive. The Ironborn fought as the Ironborn always fought, with ferocity and skill. But ferocity and skill against a coordinated fleet with superior numbers and tactical command produced the result that superior numbers and tactical command always produced: defeat. The Ironborn were driven from the islands. The Tyrell garrisons were reinstalled. Stannis' fleet patrolled the Sunset Sea with the methodical thoroughness that was Stannis' signature, the patrol a message that was louder than any raven. The crown's reach extended to the water, and the water was not the Ironborn's to claim. Balon Greyjoy retreated to Pike. The test had been administered, and the result was clear. The young king was not Robert, who had defeated Balon through overwhelming force, and he was not Aerys, who might have ignored the islands entirely. The young king was something new, a ruler who responded to provocation with precision rather than fury, who used military force as a component of strategy rather than as a substitute for it. The Tyrell question remained. Margaery Tyrell was 17, beautiful, charming, politically acute, the product of Olenna's education and Mace's ambition. The Tyrell proposal was not subtle. Margaery as queen, Tyrell wealth as treasury, Tyrell soldiers as army. The South and the Crown united through the marriage bed, the oldest alliance mechanism in Westerosi politics. Stefan was already married. The Sansa alliance was the foundation of his reign. But the Tyrells did not accept foundations. The Tyrells built additions, renovations, expansions. If Margaery could not be queen, she could be something else. A lady in waiting to the queen. A presence at court, a visible symbol of Tyrell influence that operated alongside the Stark influence without replacing it. Sansa handled the Tyrell overture with a grace that surprised even Olenna. The queen, 16, red-haired, the girl from the Godswood who had become the woman on the throne, received Margaery with warmth and intelligence and the social acuity that the Starks and the Tyrells did not share, but that Sansa had developed through observation and practice. Sansa made Margaery a companion. Sansa made Margaery a friend. And in making Margaery a friend, Sansa neutralized the threat that Margaery represented, because a friend at court was an ally rather than a rival, and the distinction between ally and rival was the distinction between cooperation and competition. The Stark girl is smarter than she looks, Olenna observed. The Stark girl is exactly as smart as she looks, Ned replied. Her intelligence is visible to anyone who looks at her face instead of her hair. The North produces more surprises than I expected. I came south to marry my granddaughter to a king, and instead I find a queen who has already occupied the position my granddaughter wanted to fill. The girl has my respect. Tell her I said so. Tell her yourself. I intend to. And I intend to enjoy her response. The young fascinate me, Lord Stark. They are full of potential and utterly unpredictable. It is the only entertainment left to an old woman. The Spider's Gift. Varys came to the king on a night in the 3rd year of his reign with information that changed the shape of the realm. Your Grace, I must speak with you about a matter that will cause you pain. Most of your matters cause me pain, Lord Varys. Sit. Varys sat. The Spider's face was arranged in the expression that preceded unpleasant revelations, the composed sympathy that was either genuine concern or the most convincing simulation of genuine concern that Stefan had encountered. After 3 years, Stefan still could not determine which. The boar hunt that killed your father. What about it? The wine that your father drank that day was fortified. Triple-strength Arbor Gold, sweetened to conceal the potency. Your father was incapacitated before the hunt began. The boar killed a man who could not have defended himself against a kitten. Stefan's hands went still. The stillness was deliberate, the conscious arrest of physical movement that accompanied the processing of information that required all available cognitive resources. Who? Lancel Lannister served as your father's squire. Lancel filled the cup. Lancel has since left King's Landing. He departed for the Westerlands 2 months after your father's death, claiming family obligations. He is currently at Casterly Rock, under my grandfather's protection, under your grandfather's roof. Whether the action was taken at your grandfather's direction, at your mother's direction, or at Lancel's own initiative, is a question that I cannot answer from the evidence available. But you have an opinion. I have observations. Lancel Lannister is not a man of initiative. He is a follower. Followers require leaders. The leaders available to Lancel at the time of the hunt were limited: the Queen, who was exiled to the Rock, but whose communications with agents in King's Landing were not, as we have discussed, entirely severed. And your grandfather, whose interest in Robert Baratheon's continued reign was complicated by the humiliation that Robert's continued reign represented. Stefan stood. He walked to the window. The city spread below him in the darkness, the 1,000 lights of King's Landing, the torches and candles and fires that marked 500,000 lives, the geography of a capital that his grandfather had helped build and that his mother had helped poison, and that was now his to govern. You are telling me that my mother may have killed my father. I am telling you that the evidence permits that conclusion. I am not telling you that the evidence compels it. The distinction matters to you. It does not matter to me. Then I will say what the evidence compels. Your father's death was not an accident. The wine was tampered with. The person who tampered with it had connections to Casterly Rock. The motive: to remove a king whose reign was unfavorable to Lannister interests, and to replace him with a boy king whose affection for his Lannister relatives might be leveraged, is consistent with the strategic thinking of the people at Casterly Rock. Stefan was 17. He had been king for 2 years. He had diffused a Lannister economic crisis, navigated a Littlefinger political conspiracy, repelled an Ironborn invasion, managed a Tyrell alliance, and maintained a correspondence with a brother whose innocence might be a weapon in his mother's hand. He had done all of this with Ned Stark's counsel and his own judgment, and the judgment had been, by any measure, excellent. The judgment was now being tested in a way that no previous test had approached. The question was not political or military or economic. The question was personal. Did his mother kill his father? And if she did, what did the king, the son of both the murderer and the victim, do about it? He went to Ned. The conversation was held at midnight, in Ned's chambers, with the fire burning low and the hour producing the honesty that daylight sometimes concealed. Varys has brought me evidence that my father's death was not an accident. Ned's face changed. The change was not surprise. It was the revelation of a suspicion that Ned had carried, but not voiced. The confirmation of a fear that had lived in the back of his mind since the day Robert died. Tell me. Stefan told him. The telling was precise. The facts as Varys had presented them, the conclusions as Varys had drawn them, the implications as Stefan had understood them. The precision was the mechanism through which Stefan maintained his composure. Because the composure depended on treating the information as data rather than as the revelation that his mother might have murdered his father. What do you want to do? Ned asked. What should I do? I asked what you want, not what you should. The two are not the same. Steffon sat in the chair opposite Ned, the chair where Jon Arryn had once sat, where Robert had once sat, where the history of the realm's governance was written in the wear of the wood and the stains of spilled wine. The young king in the old chair, the present in the past seat. I want to ride to Casterly Rock with an army and burn it to the ground. And I can't. Because burning Casterly Rock kills the Golden Children. Because a war with the Westerlands bankrupts the kingdom. Because my grandfather commands 30,000 swords and the Crown's army is committed to the Shield Islands patrol. Because vengeance is not justice, and I was taught the difference. Then you know what to do. I know what to do. I don't know how to live with doing it. Ned reached across and gripped the boy's arm. The grip was the grip of a father, not the father who had died, but the father who had chosen, who had raised, who had guided. Ned had been Steffon's father more completely than Robert in every way that mattered, and the grip was the acknowledgement that the relationship had transcended its official boundaries and become something personal, something real, something that the kingdom's politics could not touch. You live with it the way every good king has lived with it. You do what is right. You pay the cost. And you do not let the cost change who you are. Steffon sent an envoy to Casterly Rock. The envoy carried a demand, Lancel Lannister to be surrendered to the crown for questioning regarding the death of King Robert. The demand was formal, legal, proper. The crown's right to investigate the death of a king. The legal mechanism that even Tywin Lannister could not refuse without declaring open rebellion. Tywin received the demand and read it and sat in his solar for an hour without speaking. The hour was the time that Tywin required to assess the situation, calculate the options, and determine the course of action that maximized Lannister interests while minimizing Lannister exposure. The calculation was this: Lancel was expendable. Lancel's testimony, if extracted under pressure, could implicate Cersei. Cersei's implication could lead to a trial. A second trial would destroy whatever remained of the Lannister reputation. And the destruction of the reputation was the one outcome that Tywin could not accept. Because the reputation was the foundation on which everything else, the gold, the power, the legacy, was built. Lancel disappeared. The disappearance was total. The boy was there one day and gone the next, and the going was permanent. And the permanence was the work of men whose profession was the making of permanent disappearances. Tywin reported to the Crown's envoy that Lancel had fled, left Casterly Rock in the night, destination unknown, the flight of a guilty man who feared the Crown's justice. The lie was transparent. Steffon knew it was a lie. Ned knew it was a lie. Varys, who had anticipated the disappearance and who had made no effort to prevent it because the disappearance served his own purposes, knew it was a lie. But the lie was also impenetrable. Without Lancel, there was no witness. Without a witness, there was no case. Without a case, there was no trial. The evidence of Robert's murder died with the witness, and the death was Tywin's final gift to his daughter, the elimination of the evidence that would have destroyed her. Steffon received the news and felt the rage build in his chest like a fire in a sealed room, growing hotter, growing larger, consuming the available air, producing heat that had nowhere to go. The rage was his father's rage, the Baratheon fury, the Storm's inheritance. The emotion that Robert had expressed through war and wine, and that Steffon had to express through governance. He summoned the small council. The summons was for the following morning. The king spent the night in the Godswood, not the southern Godswood of the Red Keep, but the small garden that Sansa had planted with northern seedlings, a place where the old gods were present, if not powerful, where a man could sit beneath a young tree and wrestle with decisions that no amount of counsel could make for him. Sansa found him there. His wife, the red-haired girl who had become a queen. She sat beside him, as she had sat beside him on the first day, in the original Godswood, when they were children and the world was simpler. "I know what Varys told you," she said. "Varys told you?" Varys tells everyone everything. He tells each person a different piece. The skill is in assembling the pieces. And what pieces did you assemble? That your mother may have killed your father, that your grandfather destroyed the evidence, that you are the son of both the murderer and the victim, and that the crown you wear was placed on your head by the crime that your family committed against itself. That's a larger piece than I expected. I am the queen. My pieces are larger. He looked at her, Sansa at 16, the girl who had been raised on songs of heroes, and who had discovered that the heroes were complicated and that the songs were simplifications, and who had, rather than becoming bitter, become wise. The wisdom was not complete. She was 16, and the gaps in her experience were as visible as his. But the wisdom was real, and the realness was the quality that Stefan valued above all others, because he had spent his life surrounded by people whose performances outpaced their authenticity. I cannot punish my grandfather, he said. I cannot try my mother. The evidence is gone. The witness is gone. The justice that my father deserves is unreachable. Then what justice is reachable? The justice of a good reign. The justice of proving that the murder was pointless, that the king they killed to create a puppet produced instead a ruler, that the chaos they wanted to exploit was converted into order that they cannot disrupt. That's not justice. That's revenge dressed as governance. Is there a difference? Yes, justice is for the victims. Revenge is for yourself. A good reign is for the kingdom. If you want justice, find another witness. If you want revenge, destroy your grandfather. If you want a good reign, let the murder go and govern. I can't let it go. Then, carry it. Carry it the way my father carries the memory of my Aunt Lyanna. Carry it and let it make you better instead of bitter. The carrying is the price. The price is the job. The small council met the next morning. Stefan arrived with the decision made, and the composure restored, and the rage converted, not extinguished but redirected, channeled from the destructive path to the constructive, the Baratheon storm harnessed rather than unleashed. The investigation into King Robert's death is closed, Stefan announced. The witness has fled. The evidence is insufficient. The matter will not be pursued further. The council members exchanged glances. The glances communicated the wordless assessment that councils performed when they recognized that the king's statement concealed more than it revealed, and that the concealment was deliberate, and the deliberation was strength. However, Stefan continued. The crown's relationship with Casterly Rock will be restructured. The remaining Lannister debt will be renegotiated on terms that reflect the crown's current financial position rather than the terms that Lord Tywin imposed during the crisis. The crown will develop alternative revenue sources that reduce dependence on Lannister lending, and the surveillance of the exiled queen's communications will be increased. The measures were not punishment. They were insulation. The systematic reduction of the crown's vulnerability to Lannister leverage. The construction of economic independence that would deny Tywin the financial weapon he had wielded throughout Stefan's reign. The measures were long-term. The measures were patient. The measures were the kind of strategic response that Tywin himself would have employed, and the irony was not lost on anyone in the room. The realm endures. Stefan Baratheon ruled for 37 years. The statement is not the story. The story is in the details, the thousands of decisions, the hundreds of crises, the dozens of betrayals and alliances and marriages and deaths that composed a reign that historians would later call the most stable period of governance since Jaehaerys the Conciliator, and that the people who lived through it simply called the peace. The Golden Children's fate was decided in the 5th year of Stefan's reign. Joffrey, who had spent his adolescence fermenting in Tywin's household, attempted to raise a rebellion in the Westerlands, a futile, ill-planned adolescent eruption that Tywin himself crushed before it began, because Tywin understood that the rebellion threatened not Stefan, but the Lannister legacy. And the legacy was the one thing that Tywin protected above all others. Joffrey was sent to the wall. The sending was Tywin's decision more than Stefan's, the old lion cutting away the gangrenous limb to save the body. Joffrey arrived at Castle Black with the rage of a boy who had been denied everything, and the skills of a boy who had been trained by the finest fighters in the Westerlands, and the temperament of a boy who had never learned that the world did not owe him what he wanted. He rose to master-at-arms. He was never happy. He was, for the first time in his life, useful. Myrcella married a Dornish prince, Trystane Martell, the youngest son of Doran Martell, a match that Tywin arranged and that Steffon approved because the match served multiple purposes. It gave Myrcella a future. It bound Dorne to the crown through a connection that did not threaten the succession, and it acknowledged the Martells' long grievance against the Lannisters by placing a Lannister grandchild in a Dornish house as a symbol of reconciliation. Myrcella thrived in Dorne. The water gardens suited her temperament, the warmth, the tolerance, the culture that valued intelligence over aggression. She became, in time, a respected member of the Martell household, and her children, dark-haired, olive-skinned, carrying the mixed inheritance of Lannister and Martell blood, were the physical proof that the old hatreds could be outlived. Tommen became a septon. The gentleness that Cersei had despised and that Tywin had tolerated found its natural expression in the faith, the devotion, the service, the life of purpose without power that suited a boy whose nature was compassion and whose inheritance was scandal. Tommen served in the Starry Sept in Oldtown, tending the sick and teaching the young and living the quiet life that the noise of his childhood had denied him. He wrote to Steffon on feast days. The letters were warm, genuine, unburdened by the political calculations that had weighted every previous piece of correspondence between the brothers. The channel that Cersei had opened as a weapon had become, over time, the connection that she had never intended, a real relationship between brothers who loved each other across the distance that their families' crimes had created. Cersei died at Casterly Rock in the 19th year of Steffon's reign. The death was old age, the simple, unspectacular death of a woman whose body had outlasted her ambitions and whose mind had outlasted her body. She died in her chambers, surrounded by servants, with Jaime at her side. Jaime, who had lived at the Rock in exile for 2 decades, whose hair had gone grey, and whose famous face had been weathered by time and regret and the slow erosion of the certainties that had defined his youth. The Golden Twins, born together, died within a year of each other. Jaime following Cersei into the darkness with the loyalty that had defined their relationship and that had been both their greatest love and their greatest destruction. Steffon did not attend the funeral. The absence was not cruelty. It was the decision of a king who understood that his presence at Casterly Rock would be interpreted as either forgiveness or obligation, and that neither interpretation served the kingdom. He sent a letter instead. The letter was private, unsealed, unregistered, delivered by a rider that Steffon trusted. The letter said, "You were my mother. I did not understand you. I do not forgive what you did. But I grieve you, because the grief is mine, regardless of the forgiveness. Rest now. The war is over." Tywin had died 3 years before Cersei, the great lion, the most powerful lord in the 7 kingdoms, dying in his bed at Casterly Rock with his empire intact and his legacy secured and his grandchildren distributed across the realm in positions that reflected his planning and his will. The death was the death of an era, the passing of the generation that had fought the rebellion and maintained the peace and destroyed the peace and rebuilt the peace, the generation whose ambitions and failures had shaped the world that the next generation inherited. Ned Stark served as Lord Councillor until the 10th year of Steffon's reign, when the Northern Lord's health declined to the point where the journey between Winterfell and King's Landing, the journey that Ned had made dozens of times, the long road south that Ned had never loved, became too difficult for his aging body. Ned returned to Winterfell and served Steffon from a distance, letters, ravens. The occasional journey south when the king's need was great and the Lord's body was willing. Catelyn was with him. Their children were grown, Robb ruling the north as warden, Arya travelling the world with the fierce independence that Ned had never managed to temper, Bran studying at the Citadel, Rickon commanding a garrison on the wall. The Stark family, like the realm they served, was dispersed but connected, spread across the map but united by the bonds that Ned's character had established. Sansa gave Steffon 3 children. The eldest was a boy, black-haired, blue-eyed, the Baratheon colouring continuing into the next generation, with the stubborn persistence that the blood dictated. The boy was named Robert, after the grandfather he had never met, and the naming was an act of reconciliation rather than tribute, the acknowledgement that Robert Baratheon, for all his failures, had been the man whose seed had produced the king who saved the kingdom. The second child was a girl, red-haired, blue-eyed, the Stark and Baratheon lines combining to produce a child who looked like neither parent and both. The new face of a dynasty that was being rebuilt on foundations stronger than the originals. She was named Lyanna, and the naming was Stefan's decision, made after Ned told him the story of the girl in the tower and the promise that had shaped Ned's life, and that the telling transformed from secret to memory. The third child was a boy, black-haired, green-eyed, the Lannister colouring appearing in a single feature, the emerald eyes that recalled Cersei in a face that was otherwise Baratheon. Stefan named him Jon, after the man who had raised 2 boys at the Eyrie, and who had died because he had discovered a truth that the realm needed to know. The naming was the completion of a circle, the dead hand remembered in the living prince, the teacher honoured through the student's child. Stefan governed well. The statement is not sentiment, it is assessment, the evaluation that historians would make decades after the king's death, and that the people who lived during his reign made every day. He governed well because he governed with awareness, the awareness of his own limitations, the awareness of his advisors' strengths, the awareness that the kingdom was not a castle to be held, but a garden to be tended, and that the tending required patience and attention, and the daily, unglamorous work that kings who loved glory neglected, and that Stefan, who had never loved glory, performed. He rebuilt the treasury without Lannister dependency. He maintained the Stark alliance without northern domination. He managed the Tyrells through inclusion rather than exclusion. He held Dorne through the Myrcella marriage. He contained the Ironborn through naval strength. He survived Littlefinger's conspiracies through the intelligence network that Varys maintained, and that Stefan, over the years, learned to read with the sophistication that the network required. He did not conquer. He did not expand. He did not build monuments or wage wars or perform the dramatic acts that bards celebrated and that children remembered. He governed. The governing was not the material of songs. The governing was the material of ledgers and laws and roads and harvests and the 1,000 administrative decisions that kept 500,000 people fed and a continent at peace. The material was unromantic. The material was sufficient. Sansa was beside him through all of it. The girl from the Godswood became the woman on the throne, became the queen who complemented the king, her social intelligence to his analytical mind, her warmth to his reserve, her ability to read people to his ability to read situations. They were not a love story in the way that Robert and Lyanna had been a love story. No tragic passion, no stolen winter roses, no war fought in the name of an impossible love. They were a partnership. The partnership was built on respect, on mutual interest, on the shared experience of having been young together during a crisis that could have destroyed them both. The partnership was not dramatic. The partnership was durable, and Stefan, the black-haired boy who had been born in the first year of Robert's reign, the boy whose existence had simultaneously protected and condemned his mother, the boy who had been the evidence that convicted the woman who bore him, the boy who had carried the weight of his family's destruction on shoulders that were too young for the burden, became the king who proved that the Baratheon name was worth more than the man who had given it to him. The 7 kingdoms endured, not through dragons or warhammers or the divine right that the Targaryens had claimed, through governance, through the daily, unglamorous, essential work of keeping a continent fed and defended and governed, through a boy who became a man who became a king, who understood that the throne was not a prize to be won, but a responsibility to be borne, and that the bearing was the job, and the job was enough. The cost. There is a story told in the taverns of King's Landing, in the years after Stefan's death, about a merchant who asked a septon what kind of king Stefan Baratheon had been. Was he a good king? The merchant asked. He was a king who governed, the septon said. He did not hunt like his father. He did not burn like the Mad King. He did not conquer like Aegon. He sat the throne and did the work and held the realm together for 37 years, and then he died in his bed with his wife beside him, and his children around him, and his kingdom at peace. But was he good? He was the son of a drunk and a schemer. He was raised by a man who died for the truth and mentored by a man who lived for honor. He was born into a lie, and he governed with honesty. He was betrayed by his mother, and he loved his mother anyway. He lost his father, and he avenged his father by being a better king than his father ever was. That doesn't answer my question. Every question about kings has the same answer, friend. They are what the realm needed them to be. Stefan was what the realm needed. Whether that makes him good is a question for the gods. Whether that makes him enough is a question for the rest of us. The merchant finished his ale and left. The Septon returned to his prayers. And the city, the sprawling, stinking, magnificent, ungovernable city that Stefan had spent his life maintaining, continued to live and to grow, and to forget the men who had built it, and the women who had broken it, and the children who had inherited the pieces. The black-haired boy was gone. The king was remembered, and the kingdom, the broken, rebuilt, enduring kingdom, remained.